Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to a discussion I'm going to have here with Terry Sejnowski about the long story of neural nets and how they got to where they are now. So I guess, Terry, I'm curious to begin with. When did people first realize that there were neurons in the brain?
Well, I think that the idea of a neuron, by the way, as a unit of the brain goes back to Cajal. He was a Spanish neuroanatomist around 1900, and he used something called the Golgi stain, which it's like a part of a reduced silver method, like for photography, which stained neurons in their entirety, but only like 1 in 100, and so that produced beautiful fills, and he drew them and was spectacularly successful. And at that point, that was considered the unit that was called the neuron doctrine. But in fact,
but before that, what did people think the brain was made of? I mean, there were anatomists before Romano Cajal. So
okay.
What did they think the brain was made of?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there were theories that go back to Descartes. Thought it was a pneumatic. That they knew about these processes, that they look like wires, but they thought they were little tubes that carried fluid. And they are indeed, but not the pressure. There was the signal was not the pressure. So they knew about them, and I think that they probably had various theories over the years. But I think it wasn't until Galvani and others, again, at the early part of the 20th century, who discovered that electricity was being carried by these nerves. And that kind of started the modern era, the electrophysiological approach to understanding the signals.
But so people knew, I mean, people obviously knew from Volta and the frog's legs and things that muscles had to do with electricity. But how did they figure out that things in the brain had to do with electricity?
Well, let's see. I think that I can't put my finger on a specific experiment, but I would say that it was not much of a leap from the stimulating. They stimulated the nerve to the muscle, right? So they had the idea that this was coming from the brain, signal transported along the nerve. But I think that it wasn't until Hans Berger, probably, who was able to record EEG signals from the scalp and showed that it was modulated by your level of arousal and what you were thinking, that he saw that it was modulated, and that was it was a microvolt electric signal, but that was a clear indication that there was electrical signals flying around inside the brain.
So when was that, like 1920s or something, or was that
No, like 1910, something around there, 12.
So it was around the same time as electrocardiography was being invented. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, that was EEG, electroencephalography. That's exactly right.
No, but I mean the heart version of that, the EKG.
Oh, cardiology. Yes. Okay, electrocardiology. Yeah, that probably about the same time. I think you needed amplifiers that were sensitive enough, and I think once you had them, then you could record all over the place.
Right. So people decided there were all these kind of wire-like things in the brain. And did people, I mean, after Romano Cajal, was there a huge sort of development of people dissecting different parts of the brain and figuring out lots of detail, or not so much?
Oh yeah, that was a big business, because there are a lot of parts to the brain, and there are many species that you could look into. And Cajal was still with the leaders in his lifetime. He wrote the book that is still used today, because it's not just scientifically interesting, it's artistically interesting. Because what he would do is to look through his microscope all day, no photography there, that it was all artistic. In the evening, he would sit down and draw what he saw, the shapes and sizes and the way they're connected. And they're beautiful. They're just beautiful art. But it's withstood the test of time in that sense, that we still refer to it. And I often show one of his pictures at the beginning of my talk, just because it's just a nice way to honor our foundations, and also just a very nice, pretty drawing.
But so why weren't they using cameras, by the way? Because I mean, photography certainly existed at that time.
Well, you have to talk to Cahal about that. My guess is that it was easier for him to draw than to worry about photography and trying to keep track of things. I think photography, the daguerreotypes, I think were developed at the time, but those are really required very high illumination, and I'm not sure they were had the resolution that you needed at that point.
Right. But okay, so then we're getting, 1920s and things like that. There were electromechanical devices that people were building as, to do machinery kinds of things, and there was people investigating the brain. When did those connect?
I would say that the foundation of modern electrophysiology was in that period, the 20s and 30s. And I think it was, what the types of experiments people would do would be to stimulate a part of the brain, and then to see what would happen. And you could do that in animals, and even in some cases in humans. Actually, what was most what we know about localization of function actually came from war wounds in World War I, where people got shot. Part of their brain was taken, was like in the back of the brain, right? There's a common, you have a shell that takes away the posterior part of the brain, and you're blind. And lo and behold, they were able to map out the different parts of the cortex. Now that was anatomy, but in order to be able to stimulate and to record, really required development of other techniques. For example, they had, of all things, a smoked drum that they used for recording electrical signals. Before, the photography was used routinely. I have to say that I haven't read that literature in detail, but it was by the 40s, certainly things were going full blast. People could record. They had a really good idea of what were called action potentials. There's a famous set of 3 papers that Hodgkin and Huxley published in 1952, which was the now, a classic explanation for the the ionic basis of the action potential. And so I would say between 1930 and 1950, that was a golden period where the new techniques were being developed. And by the way, what as in science, everything depends on the techniques that are available for the instrumentation, the way that you take the data, analyze it, and that just changes with every generation.
Right. But so big moment for neural nets, 1943, McCulloch and Pitts. And at least that's my impression of the big moment for neural nets. McCulloch, I don't know all the dates. Did you ever meet McCulloch?
No, I've never met him. I've written an obituary for him, but I've never met him. I know people that have met him. He was at MIT at the time. He was a very interesting character. He had a medical background, but he decided he wanted to go into understanding the brain as a more basic approach. And he was charismatic. He attracted a lot of really interesting people around him, really smart people. Pitts was a mathematical genius, but he had psychological problems. But McCulloch sort of was able to buffer him from the vicissitudes of life. And together they published this paper that, as you say, did have a lot of impact. And what they showed was that what was known about neurons at the time, it was that they had a lot of inputs, and then they had a single output, which was either a spike or not. So that kind of is like a binary event, although it's not really, because the timing is continuous. But nonetheless, it was a simple output summation, which we now know is nonlinear, but a single output. What they showed was that with that simple the McCulloch Pitts unit, you can construct logic, AND gates, OR gates, and since you can, from that, you can compute, you do universal computing. They said, well, neurons can universally compute. So that was the thrust, and I think it had an impact primarily on the mathematicians, but it did in a sense it introduced the idea that the brain might compute something like a computer, maybe not exactly, but that it was doing what it was doing was computing.
And so, I mean, the origin of that effort. I mean, so McCulloch, I think, had been a psychiatrist and so on, and was I think when they wrote that paper in Chicago, then I mean, it's a paper that I think, you know, its only references are to, you know, things like, you know, Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, things like that. I don't think it has any kind of physiological references, so to speak. It presents itself as something a bit like a Turing machine kind of presentation of, you know, this is how we might imagine brains work.
That's true. That's why I said that it was written for a computational audience or a more mathematically oriented audience. But there was another paper he wrote about the same time, which was much more influential on the biologists, and we now call the neuroscientists. That's a relatively recent area of the term neuroscience. But it was, let's see if I can remember the title. Oh yeah, What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain.
That was the Jerry Lettvin thing, right?
That was with Jerry Lettvin. Oh yeah, that was later. That's true. But I guess what I'm saying is that his influence on the brain science was really much more. That paper had a much larger influence than his early.
Because my impression is, if I remember the dates, I might have them wrong. I think like the Jerry Lettvin, McCulloch Pitts, What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain.
That's when he moved
was like
to
end
MIT.
of the 50s.
It was probably around that, yeah, end of the 50s.
I think so.
Maybe. Yeah, I'll have to check. But you know, that was still in the early days. We're talking, no, it had to be earlier than that. We could look it up, but I think it was in the maybe early 50s or 40s.
So, but I mean the history, because there were other things that had happened, right? By that time, you know, Alan Turing's
43 is the date that I think it was.
No, that's the original McCulloch Pitts paper.
Oh, you're talking about Lettvin. Yeah, no, that's right. Okay.
But in, I mean, you know, there was a whole development, as I understand it, from you know, there was, you know, Alan Turing's 1936, you know, this is what a computer might be like. And then the original 1943 McCulloch Pitts paper was sort of leveraging the Turing idea to say, oh, we can make these neuron-like things that can be like Turing machines.
Okay, Steve, I just looked up the date. It's 1940.
What was?
What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain.
Really?
I'm just looking at it, and it says Proceedings of the IEEE, 1940. I think this is the 41. Now it says. No, wait a second.
I don't think that is right.
That was the page number. Sorry. It's 1959. You're right. You're absolutely right.
Okay. 59. Okay.
I stand corrected. Okay.
That's I think yeah. But so, I mean, before that time, from, you know, starting in the 40s, I mean, it seems like several things were happening. I mean, there was the you know, on the more kind of artificial device type side. I mean, there was the McCulloch Pitts paper, and then, I mean, people like John von Neumann got into the picture. Wiener, I guess, Norbert Wiener got into the picture, and I mean, you know, and von Neumann was writing books like, you know, The Computer and the Brain and so on. I mean, what was the at that point, there seemed to be a whole development of people saying, you know, we're going to make electrical devices and they're going to be like brains. And people started talking about, you know, giant electronic brains and so on. And I think, I mean, that was the, you know, in some sense, I think neural nets were perhaps the original vision for what computers might be like.
Well, you know, that's an interesting observation, because if you think about it, computers came around relatively late.
Right.
Digital computers. And I think that, you know, the way that, and a lot of people also, you know, were thinking along the analog lines, including Frank Rosenblatt, you know, who came up with the perceptron. So that was an analog device that he actually built it. He physically built an analog device that It was actually a model of a single neuron, a single McCulloch Pitts neuron. No, it's interesting. The interest in building brains or something that works like the brain has waxed and waned for many decades, and with a period of about 20, 30 years. And that was a high period, back in that era, in the 50s, maybe a little before that and a little after that. That's when 59 actually was also when Rosenblatt published his perceptron paper.
But I think one famous other data point was the Dartmouth conference, 1956.
Yes, it's called the birth of artificial intelligence. Actually, what it's called is the birth of that word, because people were thinking along those lines for decades before that. I mean, it wasn't like it was a great idea suddenly. I think what really kicked it off was, by that time they did have digital computers, and they were writing programs, and they were able to write programs that could do interesting things like prove theorems and play games and that sort of thing. And they figured, wow, if we have a computer that can prove theorems, which is the highest level of human achievement, cognitive achievement, mathematics, then certainly it should be able to do other forms of intelligence, and maybe even, build robots and so forth. And that was, it was based on the false intuition that problems like vision and motor control were easy. Why? Because, it's effortless. We don't have to put much a cognitive effort into it, and everybody can do it. You don't have to be a genius to be able to. In fact, people who do sports are generally not as intellectual as the people who don't. But that era was really kind of an exciting one. But then, I would say petered out when they began to realize how difficult the problems were. And despite the fact that an enormous amount of money was spent by the government, DARPA, and WNR and other agencies, the returns were very meager in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I mean, my impression was there were projects like machine translation was a big effort that was an almost complete failure at that time.
Well, my favorite story along those lines is that they had a translator into Russian, English to Russian, and then Russian back to English. And the phrase that they tried to translate was, the spirit was willing, but the flesh is weak. And it came back, it's good wine, but rotten meat.
But how were they even doing those translations? Was this essentially a textual replacement type of approach?
Well, I have no idea what what the actual approach was, but I think that they must have had some way of thinking about syntax, because Chomsky was using that as the basis of language in that era.
I don't think he was that much involved, though. I think the machine.
No, he wasn't. No, but the people. You can't think about language without thinking about Chomsky, right? In that era, if for another reason, then people quickly realize that if you just replace word by word, it's gibberish. Just you have to have the right word order, the number 2 that has to be done somehow. But the other thing is that was completely missing, and they didn't understand at the time, was that more important than even word order is syntax. Semantics, meaning, and that's really, I think, why modern neural networks that could do language translation are primarily able to do that by being able to embed sentences and words into a high dimensional space in which neighborhoods of words share semantics.
But it is kind of interesting that, very early attempt in AI was machine translation, and the technology that's now brought us our friend ChatGPT, for example, is that same kind of technology.
Yes, that's an interesting parallel, and I hadn't thought about it. I think that there is something magical about language that really influences humans. By the way, I also contributed in a small way back in the 80s. I had a program called NetTalk, which was for that, by today's standards, a very tiny network. They had about 200-300 units in it, and about 20,000 parameters, weights between the units, which by today's standards is so tiny that it's embarrassing by comparison. But we trained it to take in a window of 7 letters and to assign the sound, the phoneme, to the middle letter. And we trained it up on a bunch of words, dictionaries, and transcriptions. And it did a credible job. We actually recorded, from a machine that turned, it was a
Deck talk. Deck talk. Yes, I remember.
Yeah, I remember that. It was very nice. It turned sounds into the phonemes into sounds. And you could actually hear the thing as it learned, and it was mesmerizing. In fact, it got so much publicity that I was on the Today Show and demonstrating net talk to the world. And even to this day, people come up to me and say, I listened to that program. And it was the first time I knew anything about neural networks, but it really, I can still remember it. It was one of those moments when you suddenly see something you didn't understand.
Well, it seemed to be very convincing in sort of going from babbling like a young child to talking like a more adult character. I mean, that seemed to be.
It did that, and we now know why. Okay, so what it did was, when it's learning, it picks up the most important or the biggest regularities, and the most regular assignment is verbs versus nouns, right? And so it would alternate between a consonant and a sound, but it wouldn't it would be the wrong sound, but it would be a vowel. Ba 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 ga da da da. That's it. Actually, I memorized that from the tapes. And then it went through a period where it got the small words right, and then it went through another period where it got bigger words right, but it would often have one of the sounds wrong. And then eventually, you could understand it. It sounded just like a little kid talking, which was. And let me just explain why that's important. And it's still today. When people, critics talk about these networks, they say, "Oh, they're stochastic parrots." Right, there was nothing stochastic about these. They're all deterministic, and they're not parrots, because there's no way that you could train a network to produce this. English is so irregular in terms of the sounds and the letters and the correspondences. There are some rules, but there are always exceptions. And if you keep writing them down, you get a book with 300 pages, but in the same architecture with very, very few weights, a few tens of thousands. It was both able to pull out the regularities and the exceptions. And it did it by learning algorithm rather than having linguists sit there and write down rules. So it was and the other thing is that it has to generalize, right? Because we can give it new words, like I remember giving it Jabberwocky. What this is the famous poem with nonsense words in it.
Right.
It was brillig and the slithy toes did gyre and gimble in the wave, right? It did a credible job, but maybe not exactly the way I pronounced it, but it was English level pronunciation that you could understand.
No, you're right. I remember this. It was a very cool demo. And thank you for publishing the paper about it in my then very young Complex Systems journal.
It was in one of your first issues. Yes.
Right. But let's go back a bit, because I'm curious. The whole question of we had McCulloch Pitts, 1943. This is what a neuron might be. This is what an idealized artificial neuron might be like. And then, but that was more, you can make sort of logic out of these things. You could make a Turing machine type thing out of these things. But then I think there was the question of, well, in brains, one of the important features is they learn. And I guess sometime, what was it? People like Hebb and so on were starting to talk about how those artificial neurons would be able to do learning. But by that point, people had the idea that the synapses, the connections between neurons, were the places where memory lived. Is that right? How did people conclude that, or when did they conclude that?
Okay. So the synapses go back to Cajal, we mentioned earlier, and by the way, it's below the level of light microscope, which is about 0.5 micron. And so it was only conjectured that that's the junction where the signal goes across. In fact, there was a big disagreement between Cahal and Golgi, who Golgi thought that there were direct electrical connections between the two neurons, and they hated each other. They would be at odds with each other scientifically, and ironically, they both won the Nobel Prize together, but were not on speaking terms. And in retrospect, this is very common in neuroscience, is that they were both right or both wrong, because there are electrical connections. They're called, gap junctions, electrical synapses, and there are chemical synapses, and they both are important in different parts of the brain, different neurons. But the idea, though, that you have memory at the synapses came a little bit later, and Hebbian plasticity is probably the most famous. But there were people before that, Konorsky and others, who had similar ideas. I think that the synapse has an allure, which I think is a little bit overrated. There's a lot of them, and there's no doubt that they change in strength. Neuroscience has really worked out a lot of the details, but it turns out that many other things are also plastic, and in particular, the intrinsic properties of neurons. So what are they? So, well, first, there is the threshold, excitability. That can be varied. There are a lot of ion channels in the different parts of the dendrites, the receiving area, and the spike initiating zone in the soma. And all of those are also plastic, that they can be modulated up and down. And so now when neuroscientists talk about plasticity, they really are talking about plasticity of the circuit, not just the synapses. And a beautiful example of that is somatic gastric ganglion of the lobster, which has only a few dozen neurons in it, and it controls the stomach, the rhythms of the stomach. And there are two rhythms. They're very slow, like 1 to 10 seconds. There's a pyloric rhythm and a gastric rhythm. And it turns out there are neuromodulators that modulate the intrinsic properties and the synaptic strengths, which can take you from one to the other, right? So in the very same network, you can have two very different behaviors. And in fact, in our brains, there are dozens of neuromodulators that do the same thing. So that on a shorter time scale, we're talking about seconds, minutes, and hours rather than days and weeks and months.
So when these signals are propagating through like the dendrites and so on, that you're saying that there are different, in addition to the kind of the synaptic weights or something of the strength of a connection between neurons, that
Right.
there are different sort of resistivities or something like that of the different parts of the dendritic tree?
Different voltage dependencies. Yeah, different voltage dependencies, which translates into differences in excitability, differences in integration time constants, differences in the dynamics. So even within the synapse, for example, there are biochemical reactions taking place that keep track of a history of the signals that have been passing through recently. For example, it's called a trace, and short-term memory is also a term that psychologists call it. And some of those biochemical reactions, can be modify the size of the synapse, and that makes it more permanent. Can change some of the properties of which ions are flowing through and how much. For example, calcium ions are very important, and that can be regulated. Those ion channels are very highly regulated. So the nature has taken computing down to the molecular level. That's why it's so efficient, and it's
Right.
extremely miniaturized, and your brain runs on less than 20 watts of power, right? And just think of everything you can do and digital computers can't do.
Right. But so we're skipping to the future, and we need to go back to the past here to get this narrative. But if we think about artificial neural nets, which have, you know, these weight matrices and biases and so on, is the thing that you're describing in terms of the characteristics of the whole neuron and its whole dendritic tree and so on. Is that captured by that, or is that not? Or is there some extra term that kind of should be in the future of artificial neural nets that captures these kinds of things that you're now finding happen in actual neurons?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're a scientist trying to understand the brain, then yes, all those details are important. But if you're just trying to extract principles, then there are some principles that are absolutely essential. And I think that the wide range of timescales in artificial networks, there's only two timescales. There's a fast inference, which it goes up and down very quickly, and then there is the training, the backprop popular training algorithm for these synapses, the weights in the network, and that's very, very slow. It takes a long time to train these networks up. So that's the kind of the longer time scale. But in the brain, there's everything in between. There's an incredible range there's working memory. There's all sorts of traces that are there that, in fact, you can show, this is something that psychologists have studied. It's very surprising. They can show that, you can look at, 1,000 pictures in a few hours. And then you come back the next day and they'll say, have you seen this before? And you are pretty good at saying yes or no. How the heck could you do that? Right? It must be the case it left a trace. These things left a trace. An enormous amount of information came in. Now, you couldn't recall them. I mean, you might be able to recall a few, but interestingly, you can, if you've seen it before. And here's something else, which I think is even more amazing. So when I ask you a question, within a second whether or not you know the answer, right? You just seem to know that. Well, in the traditional computers, you'd have to search through the whole memory bank, right? You'd have to have an enormous efficient algorithm to do that, and which means that somehow the brain has used all the machinery and all these different timescales in order to solve problems like that one very quickly, and survival depends on it.
Right. I mean, but in a neural net, the information is sufficiently distributed, and the operation of the neural net is such that that same phenomenon of you're not searching through anything, you're just running the neural net. That happens there too. I mean, it's in a more traditional kind of digital computer metaphor where you're saying, okay, these are things arranged in a file system or a database or something.
Right. Okay. So here's what it's like, and this is an analogy, so it's not perfect. Okay. And also gets to this point that you were talking about in difference between logic and what networks are good at. Networks are really good at pattern recognition. In other words, one pass through and you've got an answer, right? It's inference.
Right.
Okay. So here's what kind of computer the brain is. It's like a digital computer in which the instructions are recognize the object in 100 milliseconds. Bang, it does it, right? That's one instruction.
Yeah.
Or, construct a sentence in 1 second that you're going to just spew out a bunch of words, right? And a lot of it's been automatized so that it's very efficient, very fast. And so you're using these macro instructions that basically can solve enormously complex computational problems in a flash. And the reason there was a lot of evolutionary pressure for that, because if you can't recognize a tiger, you are toast.
Right. Well, let's come back talking of okay, let's go back to we were talking about how people kind of got from the McCulloch Pitts idea, which was essentially an idea of make logic out of something that seemed to be like the neurons people saw in brains, to then the idea of how would learning work? And that's something, I mean, that has a much more complicated history, as I understand it, in the sense that, the neural net that is in ChatGPT, for example, is extremely similar to a McCulloch Pitts neural net. But the method of training is something that took quite a while, and I think you were quite involved in figuring out how that would work.
So you're absolutely right that that learning was really the secret sauce that, of course, made neural networks able to solve all these problems. Of course, many other factors go in, computing certainly. But what's magical about learning, and psychologists have been studying learning for hundreds of years now, so it's not like a mystery that humans learn. But the question was, how do they learn? What's the mechanism? And that was something that was, has we were talking already about Donald Hebb. So let me tell you a story about Donald Hebb, which most people, even neuroscientists, aren't aware of. I only know about
contextualization. Donald Hebb was a psychologist, is that right?
He was a psychologist at McGill, and he wrote this book, Organization of Behavior, which was very influential, not because of the book, but because one phrase in the book, which is that if two neurons fire are activated simultaneously, then the connection between them should be strengthened. That's they call the Hebb synapse. So coincidence of firing leads to increase in strength. That was the idea. And it was this, in fact, when electrophysiologists actually did that experiment, that's what they discovered. Turns out to be much more complicated. But let me tell you the story. I was asked to write a review of that book in probably around 1980 or something. But it was published in 49, so it's many years later, right? But so I actually read the book, and I always thought that, well, this is an algorithm that is for associative memory, because you associate an input with an output, and that's kind of the essence of associative memory. A bit more complicated when you have interactions in the network. But no, the behaviorists were very dominant at the time, and he hated behaviorism. Behaviorism is the idea that you could do Pavlovian condition, classical conditioning, but also operant conditioning to train animals to do a repetitive task, to train them to recognize objects, and they were using it on humans too. Humans also have classical conditioning, very, very all animals, including flies, invertebrates. But I was completely wrong. So here's what the problem was that he thought he was solving. It's called the persistence of activity. So, if you have a feed-forward network, what happens is the information flies through and then it's gone. But how is it that you can remember something that happened, a few minutes ago or, an hour ago, right? There has to be some way for the activity that came in to cause some persistence, like for short-term memory in particular. And the only way that he could think of doing it is if you had some kind of recurrent connections, that would circulate activity. And then he said, well, how could you learn the new thing, right? Because you want, it's not just a delay line, right? It's got to be some way that you've strengthened synapses. And so he had the idea that if you strengthen all the synapses in a line as the activity goes through a bunch of neurons, and especially in a circle, that would maintain activity that came in for a longer time. And actually, that recurrent networks are exactly that. They hold on to information that is given at the beginning of the sequence, and they use that to then combine it with information coming in at the end of the sequence, like sequences of words. So that was and he didn't say anything about when you decrease the strength of the synapse, right? Because obviously, if it keeps increasing, you're going to saturate, and so. Interesting. What people discovered was that what's important is not that they come in at the same time, but whether one comes in a little before or after, within 10 plus or minus 10 milliseconds. If the presynaptic comes in, the input before the output, within a window of 10 milliseconds, and you increase strength. But if the input comes in 10 milliseconds after the output, then you decrease the strength. And if you think about it for a second, there's what's implicit here is the concept of causality, because if it comes in before, it could have contributed to the output, but if it came in afterwards, it certainly can't, right? So, and that's the essence of persistence, is that you have persistence of a causal chain.
So that's an actual mechanism that's observed in neurons.
Yes, that's been
described.
established in the cortex, it's in the hippocampus, and the superior colliculus. It's a universal mechanism. It's not the only one, by the way. There are many other forms of plasticity. I gave you a couple examples earlier, but even with synapses, for example, in the hippocampus, there's a beautiful paper that was published just a couple of years ago, like 4 or 5 years ago, by Jeff McGee, showing that in the hippocampus, there's another form of plasticity that has a window of 1 second. And it's when you're creating what's called a place cell in a rat, when the rat's running around, and you stimulate a pathway, and suddenly this neuron becomes active whenever the rat comes back to that location. It's called a place cell.
So going back to Hebb, so what you're saying is that Hebb imagined that you would learn things by virtue of recirculating that information through this neural net, and that if it came through again and it looked like what it was before, then that weight would somehow be increased. Was that kind of the idea?
Well, at every stage, at every point along the chain, you increase the strength. So now it comes back to the beginning and it activates the neuron again. So it's like a chain reaction.
Right.
It's a very simple idea. But in modern networks with a lot more connections, it's not a simple chain, but it has in a recurrent network, you can, like, it reverberates,
Right.
An analogy from physics.
But so that idea from Hebb, did that sort of grow into some big kind of chain of things? Because by the time one was talking about things like the perceptron and Rosenblatt and so on, that wasn't a learning system. That was a pure
okay. So now here's a really interesting chapter in neural network history, which is not always people aren't aware. I doubt if you're aware, but it's very important. There was a period in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, especially the 70s in Japan, when a couple of Japanese started actually building networks that were precursors of the ones we have today. For example, we have something called convolutional neural networks, right? And they're used for object recognition and vision. Feed forward, and they have the architecture you see in the visual cortex. Well, Fukushima in Japan, who was working for the television company at the time, had this idea of just building it, right? And he even had the idea of Hebbian plasticity. He didn't get very far because the computers there were incredibly slow, but nonetheless he had the concept, and he was given the Franklin Prize a couple of years ago to recognize his pioneering work. And another Japanese
was that the thing? I remember only this one keyword, the neocognitron. Is that
yes,
that guy?
That's it. That's it. Okay, well, that's it. I was talking about
because I only got one word, but yes, I wasn't.
But, well, you have half the battle is that you can Google it and you can find out a lot more. But the other person before I go on is Sunichi Amari, who was a mathematician, and he had developed networks that are kind of precursors of the Hopfield network. Now, they weren't the same. Hopfield network is characterized by symmetric connections, but he had the idea, though, that you could get pattern recognition out of them. And then there's a whole family of associative networks that came out of Steinbuch from Germany and others. But those have been superseded in terms of their, with the architectures and the learning algorithms.
But okay, going back again. So there was Hebb. And then the next big thing that seemed to be happening was things like the perceptron and Frank Rosenblatt, and that was what, late 1950s or something.
59 was the period when he had his book, and then that was when he got a lot. It was a competing approach to artificial intelligence, and he had some demonstrations which were very interesting. He actually built a giant analog computer with potentiometers for weights, and he had visual inputs that he could give it to it, and
with photodiodes, I get, or some kind of way of
converting. So in modern terms, this will be a one-layer neural network. I mean, this was a single. This was
it was one layer of weights. You're right, one layer of weights, and there are a class of problems for which you can actually come up with good solutions. That they're called linear predicates, where in the weight space you can draw a parallel plane that goes through the examples. If the positive and negative examples are on different sides, then you can do a discrimination between them, and it will generalize to new inputs.
So in a sense, we've gone from the one layer neural net to what ChatGPT is maybe a 400 layer neural net or something, and that's the
well, that's why they're called deep. Now this is so that there was a period in history. I remember I told you about the fact that it waxes and wanes, right? So that in that era, the early 60s, there was the resurgence of interest in artificial neural networks, on Frank Rosenblatt, artificial intelligence by writing programs for computers and so forth, and the Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert wrote a really sophisticated mathematical monograph called Perceptrons, where they did a really thorough analysis of this, what I just told you about linear predicates. And they show that there are a lot of most interesting problems don't fall into that category. So therefore, it's not a very good starting point. And they, at the end of all this beautiful math, they had this kind of the speculation saying that, in their view, there would never be a generalization to perceptron learning algorithm. The key was that you could learn it from examples, right? That's what Rosenblatt really did, right? He added the learning algorithm, which was Hebbian.
Actually, what was his learning algorithm? So what?
Okay. Here's what you do: you take the output from, you give it an input, you take the output, and then you compare it with what it should be. Is it a yes or no?
Mm-hmm.
Is this a cat or not? And then if it's right, you don't do anything, and if it's wrong, you use that error to update all the weights, so that the next time, the weights that should have pushed it above threshold get stronger, the ones that should have pushed it away get weaker.
How do you know which ones to change?
There's the gradient. You just ask, okay, how does the error change with if we change the weight?
So it's the same story as modern.
It's exactly the same story for backprop, right? It's error gradient. It's all the way.
So did Frank Rosenblatt figure that out? Was he the person who figured out?
Yes, that was the beauty. That's the perceptron learning algorithm. He figured out gradient descent. Now it was a convex problem. That means that the beauty was that it didn't matter where you started with the weights. You were guaranteed gradient descent would take you to the bottom, which would be the best set of weights that could, be able to solve that problem if it was solvable.
What was Frank Rosenblatt's background? How did he get into that?
He was a psychologist. Yeah, he was a psychologist, but he had very broad interests. And, he was interested in, first of all, things in AI or electrical engineering. And so he had a lab where he did experiments and built things. He was a polymath, you would call him today.
Right. So this was a time when there was early interest in machine vision for military applications, for optical character recognition, for things like that, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, well, that's always been, I think, a practical problem. In fact, one of the first successes was of neural networks was handwritten digit classification,
right,
for the post office. This is Jan LeCun. By the way, I want to finish the story with Martin Minsky and Papert, because this really had a huge impact.
Right.
They speculated that there would be no generalization of that learning algorithm to multi-layer networks. And that's where Jeffrey Hinton and I started. In other words, if you talk to anybody in AI or engineering, what they would tell you is that, forget it, you're working on something which is a dead end, and we have mathematical proof of that. Right? There was no mathematical proof. It was just buried in this very complex mathematical book, but it was purely speculative, right? There was no
theory behind it, except, but in any case, so Jeff and I, starting from a Hopfield network, we heated it up, and we discovered that Boltzmann, we call it the Boltzmann machine because it was fluctuating, and you could use physics to understand the equilibrium states. And we showed that in equilibrium, there was a learning algorithm for an arbitrarily as many layers as you want. And in fact, even it's really beautiful because it was a local algorithm, unlike backprop that requires global information of all the gradients and all the weights. It could all be done with just local correlations between pairs of neurons. So it was Hebbian plasticity, Boltzmann machine. We've solved the problem of multi-layer learning. We thought we had figured out how the brain works, but it turned out to be a little bit more complicated.
I remember that paper. Yes, that was like 85 or something. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. That came out. The learning algorithm came out. The actual, I think that was the paper, Cognitive Science. Yes, 85.
But so okay, but I'm still, and I know. I mean, back to the time of perceptrons, right? I mean, Marvin Minsky always used to claim that he didn't mean to kind of kill the field by writing that book. Although you must have talked to him about it. I certainly talked to him about it.
Marvin, you've talked to him a lot. You know him probably better than I do, but I actually have evidence for this, firsthand evidence. So at a meeting that was held in 2006 at Dartmouth, the 50th anniversary of the 56th meeting on AI, and there were about 6 or 7 people at the meeting from the original meeting, right? This is 50 years later, so these are old men now. Marvin was there. And at the end of the meeting was a banquet. And at the banquet, each one of them got up and said what they thought about the meeting. It was a very interesting meeting, looking forward and backwards. The future of AI and where are we now? And so they asked for questions. So I got up and I asked Marvin a question. I said, well, there are people in neural networks that consider you to be the devil because of the fact that you held back the field for decades. Are you the devil? Okay. And this I've never seen this before. It was like, I just, suddenly he just got extremely animated and he just launched into this long tirade. It was going on and on about, we didn't understand anything about scaling or complexity and blah, 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 that, parity, it doesn't do parity and so forth. And it was all, it was clearly, I had pressed his button. And so I finally had to stop him because, it was getting embarrassing. And I said, Dr. Minsky, I asked you a binary question, yes or no. Are you the devil? And he kind of spluttered. He kind of spluttered for, he didn't know what to say. And he finally said, yes, I'm the devil.
Okay. That's very Marvin-esque. I don't know. Interesting.
Now, I've come to actually moderate it in the sense that I don't think his was the only reason. I think that may have contributed. But I'll tell you, I think the real reason is that in order to make progress, you needed a lot more computing. They didn't have it back then.
But, one of the ironies, Marvin, when he was a graduate student at Princeton, had actually made a physical electronic neural net thing.
Yes.
The SNARK or something. Was that what it was called? But I don't quite know what it was.
Sounds like something in Lewis Carroll, but
yeah, well, right. I think
it could have been. Yeah, it could have been. No, I've heard that story, and I'm not sure. I don't think it's anything published, but yeah, he would build these little networks out of parts, electrical components, and I wonder about the psychology there because he clearly must have been very intrigued, and I wonder if he got burned or something that he turned his back on it. I don't know, but he wrote his thesis on this in the math department, right. And they didn't know what to make of it because nobody in the department knew anything about neural networks, and so they sent it over to the Institute for Advanced Study, and the mathematicians there only talk to God, right? So they sent back the following cryptic comment that it may not be mathematics, but someday it will be, and they were right. They're absolutely right.
I wonder who wrote that. I think von Neumann I think, had died by that point. I mean, von Neumann would have been somebody who, I think, because von Neumann was pretty involved in this whole, brains versus computers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Although I don't think
very much, yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure he ever figured out. I don't think he really did. I mean, he had a whole analysis of probabilistic logics and so on, because he was convinced that, sort of error rates were a critical feature of brains versus computers and so on. But I don't think he ever worked on neural nets. I think he had read the McCulloch Pitts paper, but I don't think he ever worked on.
Well, he in his Stillman lectures at Yale, he raised an interesting problem, which is that how is it that you prevent the introduction of imprecision, noise or error from propagating? And he came up with redundancy as one way, but it's still a very, very interesting question, right? How is it that you can the brain is so resistant to not just a little bit of noise, but also you can scoop out a big piece of the brain as long as it's not in a critical area that controls your breathing or something, you're okay.
Yeah, I'm sure the same would work. I'm sure if you took ChatGPT and you scooped out, 1 billion weights, I'm sure it would do just fine.
I think so too, and that's the point. It was called graceful degradation, and that has, I think, to do more with not so much redundancy being that usually means having identical replicates that then work, and you take the average. I think that it has something to do with multiple pathways, that there are many ways to solve the same that the brain has advantage of converging input. And also the other thing that is a major difference is that the brain is probabilistic. It has to keep track of evidence, and a lot of it comes in from different sensory systems, vision, audition, and so forth, and it has to be combined and to come up with the best guess about what was just said. Word. By the way, people who are going deaf, it helps if they're looking at the person's face, because they can do lip reading, right? Because there's a lot of information about the sound from the lips. And so, but how do you combine that, right? You have to combine those two senses, and you have to use probabilities in order to be able to eventually make the right decision. And by the way, that's the way the transformers work. What they do is they just don't pop out a word because that's the only word, but they assign probabilities to all the words, and the ones that have the highest probabilities are the ones that are used for the next loop, for the next word in the next the subsequent output.
So going back to the history for a minute, I mean, at some moment the physicists got involved. So sometime around maybe late 50s, early 60s, there started to be physicists who said, these neural nets are a little bit like spin systems, and we can, a little bit like magnetic, systems of, the neurons are a little bit like spins up and down in magnetic systems and things like that. And there can be analysis done that way. At least that's my, I mean, I don't know whether those people are even, I mean, there were people like, I don't know, there was a fellow Caniello or something who I remember running across at some point.
Yes, yeah. So there's a whole cast of characters from that era. Caniello was one of them. And actually, there was another guy who was at Irvine. I've forgotten his name now, but
Gordon Shaw.
Gordon Shaw, you got it. And you're right. They had this intuition that you should be able to use condensed matter physics to understand it. But these were isolated people who were publishing in obscure places, and I would say had little or no impact because they weren't part of a community. There wasn't a community. It was basically a lot of isolated people, very smart people, but going in different directions, and it wasn't really adding up,
Right.
And I and the other thing, of course, is that the neuroscientists couldn't understand anything that they were saying because they didn't have any background. So it was they didn't have any impact on the neuroscientists. They may have had some impact on some of their colleagues, but their colleagues didn't know anything about the brain, so they couldn't help them.
What problem did they think they were solving?
Okay, they I think, in fact, I know Gordon Shaw. I knew him, and I talked to him a little bit about this, and he he really felt that there was some kind of collective phenomenon that was going on in the brain it was like a phase transition or something, which allowed many neurons to work together collectively. And he, of course, used analogies from physics as a way of understanding that, like, the phase transition, magnetism, and so forth. And there's still people who kind of think about those lines of phase transitions, but my first experience with this group, by the way, was a meeting that I attended in 1979 here in La Jolla at UCSD that was organized by Jeff Hinton. He was a postdoc here at the time, working with Dave Rumelhart. And later,
and that was a psychology. These were psychologists. Yes?
They were cognitive psychologists. Jay McClellan, Dave Rumelhart. The PDP group was here in the 80s. And so he organized a meeting, which was called Parallel Models of Associative Memory. And that was probably the most well-established neural network model. And the idea was you have an inputs and outputs, and then you're trying to store patterns in the weights. And you could ask questions like, how many patterns can you store, and how much interference between them, and so forth. And so he invited a bunch of these isolated people, working like Don Gieman from statistics, another guy who was very interesting, Teivo Kohonen from Finland, had a way of using collective neural networks to do categorization, and others. Jerry Feldman, who was a computer scientist from Rochester, so we're talking about people from many different departments. And I was coming from physics. I was actually a postdoc at the time at Harvard Neurobiology, working with Steve Kuffler. So I was making a transition to neuroscience.
But you'd already been involved with neural nets by the time I was just looking, and I found a 1975 thing of yours about neural nets.
You're right about that. That I had already gotten bitten by the neural network bug before I got my PhD, and I did that primarily on my own. But I had a lot of help from John Hopfield, who was at Princeton at the time.
But John Hopfield was a condensed matter physicist who came out of very much that physics, but a different tradition from like the Gordon Shore world and so on. Is that correct?
It was, well, he was actually a biophysicist at the time, but, he had done earlier work on some condensed matter problems. But no,
at that point he was working on more macroscopic biophysics.
Things like hemoglobin,
I see.
Which is an interesting problem. There might be a phase transition there, when you bind oxygen and when you give it up, and he had a very influential idea about error correction. So when DNA is being when RNA is being translated to proteins, if there's a certain error rate, 1 part in I don't know 1,000 or something. But that's not good enough, because you can get all kinds of mutations then in the proteins. And so he realized that you could fix it by error correction, but it would take energy, and it has to be irreversible. Otherwise, it could go backwards. And so that turned out to be true. And that was a very important insight that comes from physics, and it was subsequently experiments were done at Bell Labs, interestingly, where he was I think he spent time there as a consultant. He was at Princeton,
right.
His academic appointment. But so he was in that kind of tradition, thinking about biological problems, and he got bitten by the neuroscience bug. It was going around. A lot of people were infected. I was, but he, unlike me, had access to all these meetings from, because the neuroscientists thought, here's somebody who's really smart, we should invite him. So he went to there's a whole series of meetings at the Neuroscience Research Program in Boston, NRP, had these meetings where they brought in people from different areas of neuroscience to come together. For example, I still have my shelf one on neural coding. Ted Bullock was the person who put that one together. Very, very prescient. And John would go to these meetings, and he'd come back and tell me about them, right? And I would hear all about the wonderful and interesting things happening in neuroscience, and maybe even more interested in trying to solve, figure out how the brain works. So that was led to, for him, the 82 PNAS paper, which was the Hopfield network. That
Right.
had a huge influence, and influence first on the physicists. I think he was able to bring into neuroscience people like Chaim Polinsky now, who's a major figure in computational neuroscience. There was
I remember, he was at Caltech at that point, and so was I, and I heard about that that network idea probably in 80, 81, something like that. And I was the frustrating thing for me is that I never managed to actually reproduce his results. That is, I wrote programs that should have done what his paper said, the things that his paper said, and they never worked. It never worked.
Okay, Stephen, you had a bug in your program, because it works for everybody else. In other words, oh, wait a second. Okay, so there's actually a subtlety here, very interesting subtlety. So it would only work if you did the updates asynchronously.
Yes, I know.
If you try to do it synchronously, it would go into limit cycles and a lot of other things. But if you did it asynchronously, it was guaranteed, literally mathematically guaranteed to converge.
But as I recall, I mean, what I tried to do was to map out the big idea is you get these attractors where there'll be a bunch of possible inputs and they all evolve to a single possible output. I mean that multiple
multiple local minima that were point attractors and could be used for doing what's called completion. In other words, you give it a half of a vector, which puts you close to the basin, and then it would complete the vector and give you the entire output. So it's a pattern completion.
Because I'm a good archivist, I'm sure I have my actual program from that time. I need to go find out.
No, I'm not accusing you of making a mistake in your program. I'm just saying that you must have had you putting in the wrong inputs or something, and it could be that you were looking at the wrong output even.
But okay, but so the point there was this was essentially a mathematical structure, not particularly intended at the time, I think, to have direct sort of correspondence with things in the brain, but a mathematical structure which would allow you to do this thing of going from many possible inputs that could represent, I don't know, a letter A or many possible things that might be like a letter A, many possible things that could be like a letter B, and it would go to the actual sort of single point attractor of it's an A or it's a B.
And the reason why that was an important step forward is that up to that time, the people who were working on these associative networks worked with linear ones, linear summations, and then a threshold. And the Hopfield showed that you could do the same thing in a highly nonlinear network, and you could store, and you could actually estimate the capacity very nicely, and it had a lot of nice properties. And like I say, it led to the Boltzmann machine and a really nice learning algorithm. So it was a breakthrough, I think, in conceptual.
Yeah, right. No, actually, I remember this capacity thing. It's like how many vectors can you store in before the thing, how many attractors fit in your space, so to speak, how many distinct yes, that was
one of the you can actually analytically show what that was. I think it was like 0.19 n, where n is the number of neurons.
Right. But so okay, so this happened, and that, I mean, that one feature of that network is it's very recurrent in the sense that you put an input and it keeps on, doing more stuff to the same input. It's not one of these kind of just feed forward, ripples through type things.
So that's what made it impressive, is that he harnessed the nonlinearity to do something interesting.
Right. So okay. So what happened next? So then that was a single network where you kept on recirculating through the network, as opposed to multiple layers of perceptron-like network.
Yeah, that's right. And because of the fact that it was kind of limited, there were no hidden units in it. it was very difficult, to build on that. Although a lot of people, I think, were thinking about, for example, I know that recently I've gotten very interested in learning sequences. And there were people who would put in asymmetric connections, that would allow the network to settle into one local minimum and then jump into another one, right? So there, I think even, the people you probably know, David Kleinfeld, I think here was one of the people. But, there was a tremendous amount of activity. It was really exciting. And the Neural Information Processing Systems meeting brought together the physicists with the neuroscientists and the computer scientists and the statisticians and people studying computer vision and speech recognition. They all came to these meetings that were organized originally by Ed Posner at Caltech. But then he died tragically, and I became the president of the foundation that ran it and have been ever since. And what was exciting back then, it was really exciting just to be able to meet people from all those different fields. And they all had the same problem, which was that the tools and techniques that were available at the time didn't allow them to make progress with vision or speech or robotics with traditional tools that they had. And they just thought that there had to be another algorithm or architecture that would do that. Neural networks were very promising because there was learning algorithms, right? You might be able to learn the solution. And we had the problem was that it was a Tower of Babel, because everybody would be speaking in their jargon, and it was hard for other people to understand what they were saying. The physicists would talk about, all these equations and attractors and so forth, and the neuroscientists couldn't figure out what that was. And then the neuroscientists would come up and talk about, all of these Greek words for different parts of the brain, the lateral geniculate nucleus. I mean, it was all Greek, impenetrable. And then the only ones that actually, I think, got through were the engineers, because they actually built things and they could demonstrate them, right? They said, here, look what I'm building here. Here's what it's supposed to do. They have their own language, but they would at least be able to explain, what the goal was and how they did it.
You didn't mention the mathematicians, who I think were not, the attractor concept was one really from mathematicians, not so much from physicists, but I don't think they were.
Well, the mathematicians came too, mainly statisticians, but there were some basic mathematicians, dynamical systems people, but not as many. In retrospect, I think that's one of the things that was missing, was that people, I think we didn't appreciate how important dynamics was going to be, and understanding the trajectories in these very large scale networks.
Although the truth is, dynamics is not, in a ChatGPT, for example, it is a feed-forward network. There isn't really dynamics.
Okay. Well, you'd be surprised. Okay, first of all, there's a loop that takes you from the output to the input, and it circulates. That's dynamics.
Right. It's an outer loop, so to speak.
It's an outer loop, but that outer loop is found in the brain too, between the cortex and the basal ganglia. And that's how I'm able to speak to you in a sequence of words, because my basal ganglia has learned how to do that, and is automatically, without having to think about it.
Right. Well, so but back. Okay, so we're now in the 80s, and we're heading for your contribution with Boltzmann Machines and so on, which was so I think some precursor to that must have been like the simulated annealing idea. People have been, you're trying to find the minimum of this kind of mountainous surface, and you're using gradient descent, and you typically get stuck in the mountain lakes, so to speak.
Right.
And then there was this idea from 1980 or so of, if you kind of just jiggle things around like you do when you are trying to make something crystallize well in annealing.
Right.
If you jiggle things around, there's more likelihood that you'll not get stuck.
You just brought back a memory, this vivid memory. So Jeff and I were collaborating at the time, and our view was that if you connected up the network properly with the right connections between different features, like we saw in the visual system, that we could make progress with vision. And then the question is, can you learn those connections? And I remember I just had read a paper by Scott Kirkpatrick on simulated annealing. He was at IBM, Thomas J. Watson at the time. And I said to Jeff, you know, we could, the Hopfield network is running at 0 temperature. You always pick the lowest energy. You either flip up or not, depending on which has the lowest energy. So you're always going downhill energy. That's why you can prove that it has to converge eventually. And I said, we just heat it up. And so that was that I remember, because once we had that, then we were able to start thinking about, first of all, avoiding local minima at high temperature. So you go to high temperature and then you gradually reduce the temperature. And if you do it slow enough, you can prove that you'll eventually find the global minimum, but you have to do it really slow.
I dispute the claim that you can prove that.
Well, you have to go in logarithmic time. That was the hook, was that you have to go really slowly.
Okay.
But nonetheless, and it became longer and longer the bigger the network, because the whole thing has to come to equilibrium, all the parts, and they have to trade information, activity patterns.
I see. This is specifically for a neural net, because the general case, arbitrary function.
That's right. But what we discovered, and this is for me, it was a shock, because that's not what we were looking for. But we discovered that something magical happens in equilibrium, which is that suddenly, with just Hebbian learning, you can reduce a loss function that had to do with the loss between the input and the output. If you're training it to do some kind of categorization or just any function, going from input to output function, you could minimize that over time. And again, if you come to equilibrium, you can show that if there's a network that is able to do that transformation or categorization, then Boltzmann machine could find it, and it could have arbitrary number of hidden layers. It just took enormously, a long time for it to come to equilibrium and then compute all the statistics. So you have to compute the average correlation over many time intervals.
But is that happening because basically it's ergodic? It will eventually visit every state, and so one of those states.
That's the assumption. That's the assumption you have to make to come to the conclusion that it's going to find the solution, and it's just a very slow process, and I still think it's much more beautiful than backprop. Backprop is kind of a statistician's nightmare. You're twiddling all these parameters, and you're not really being able to. There's no real theory behind it. It's just taking gradients. But it works very.
You could argue it's the great savior of multivariate calculus.
Oh no! We use backprop for. It was just when that came in, actually, that saved our net talk, because Boltzmann machine was taking too long. But as soon as we put backprop in, boy, it would solve it overnight.
So what was the origin of the backprop idea?
Well, I remember I was visiting Jeff in Pittsburgh, and he told me that Dave Rumelhart had this idea about taking gradients, the partial derivatives of the loss with respect to each weight in the network, and how you can use a chain rule. And I said that, well, that's interesting, but it's not as nice as the Boltzmann machine.
But so
which is able to do that. Pardon?
That's a very mathematical idea for a psychologist to have.
Dave was a really unusually, I would say, broadly based psychologist. He was working at the time on language and was trying to understand something about how, with J. McClellan, something about how words work together. And he had the idea that you could use a network with constraints in it between different words that could settle to some kind of interpretation of what words went together, noun phrases and things, by relaxation. And in a sense, though, he was beginning to think about dynamics. So I think that's what led him to this backprop idea. And it was interesting. The PDP books came out in '86, which was when the first paper came out, backprop paper in Nature. So they already had that for a few years, and I was using it in NetTalk already.
when they started talking about backpropagation, what was it? Was it introduced as a kind of applied mathematics idea, or was it introduced as a in what
No,
field
it was.
it?
Oh, by the way, the actual algorithm goes way back. A lot of people had it. In fact, there's a control theory book that goes back to the 40s, I think, where they just posited that you could solve a class of control theory problems if you did this gradient, taking the gradients in a large network. And the problem was that people just couldn't simulate it because the computers couldn't take it. So nobody had actually applied it to anything practical. So Dave was, and along with Jeff, were applying it to these networks that we're building. Right, we were simulating all these networks with the Boltzmann machine. So he said, "Well, I'll just take one of the networks and I'll apply backprop to it." And boy, was it efficient! Right, like I said, we used it for NetTalk. It was a summer research project by a graduate student from Princeton, by the way.
But so what were the other practical things going on at that time? So there was NetTalk, I remember. I mean, what were the other things where people were actually sort of using neural nets and doing stuff that they could demo?
Well, I gave you the example earlier about lip reading. So I had a graduate student from electrical engineering who combined the spectrogram from the auditory signal and then the mapped the face with lips into the spectrogram and then combined them and showed that you could improve anybody's speech recognition system with that. As long as.
But there was also, as I recall, I mean, there was the optical character recognition people, and I don't really. That was much more of a practical kind of engineering thing. Where people,
that's right. There were a bunch of engineering, engineers particularly like this and applied it to a lot of things. By the way, there are earlier people like Bernie Widrow who are using it for simple networks for equalization in modems and how to shift the frequency bands, away from the noise.
Huh.
And so there were a lot of these small engineering applications, not non-trivial ones, by the way, which were already there and people were using them. And this was basically scaling up what they had already done. And by the way, this is something that, success has 1,000 fathers, right? And we can go back and see how so many people had pieces of the puzzle, right? And that worked under special circumstances or for a particular problem. And it wasn't until all those pieces were put together that we saw what it was going to look like. With the backprop together with the architecture and then deep networks, all of those things that was, by the way, it took 20 years to go from the concept, the learning algorithm, to something that can solve a really important practical problem. That's because you needed a lot more computing, a lot more data, and a lot better algorithms.
But so, I mean, when people were doing optical character recognition, I mean, they had been using things sort of, image processing kinds of things and saying, when there are these characteristics, it must be an A, and when there are these characteristics, it must be a B. But that had turned into a neural net story certainly by 1980, I think.
Yeah, that was right. So in computer vision, the traditional way that you solve a problem is by handcrafting features that were specific for specific objects that were invariant to, say, rotation, and projecting an object onto the two-dimensional image. And that was very, very slow because it required that your handcrafting, and also a lot of you also have to worry about whether the feature is present in other objects, right? Because they will be. So you have to have a combination of features. And then the question is, how do you do that ultimate, make the decisions? And it was in a sense, it's like building a neural network by hand, except that it was, very labor intensive and also took a long time. But the beauty of learning is, first of all, that that's done automatically. It will figure out what the features are needed at the lowest levels, and then it will combine and then be able to solve the invariance problem at a higher level, higher layer. But the real beauty of the network learning is that you don't have to be a domain expert. You just have to have lots of data, number one. Number two, the very same architecture with little twiddles in terms of number of layers, the number of units in the layer, hyperparameters, can be applied to any problem. In other words, learning is a universal method. and it trades off computing for labor. And now computing is dirt cheap compared to what it was back then, and so learning is a preferred method. And there's still, by the way, I mean, model-based solutions are still important and useful for small problems, but they don't scale very well.
Well, I know, I remember in 2010 probably talking to you, I was interested in curating kind of machine vision methods for common kinds of objects. And that was, when things like the Viola-Jones method for finding, faces and so on was there, and that was a image processing based idea. And I was really close to putting a lot of effort into curating, 100 different kinds of objects and figuring out what that was saved by deep learning in 2012 or something.
That's 2012 was the turning point, yeah, for the famous ImageNet NeurIPS poster presentation by Jeff and a couple of his graduate students. By the way, Paul Viola, of the Viola-Jones face detector, it just detected faces, by the way, that was a difficult problem. You have an image, and where are the faces, right? And he got his PhD from MIT working in my lab in the 80s. He came to my lab because there's no one else at MIT who was working on neural networks.
Huh. Okay. But that was a neural net based thing. I mean, in the end, it was all a lot of the concepts that went into it was entropy. He used entropy and a bunch of other concepts that came from neural networks. No, it's a neural network. It clearly had some labor in it in terms of how to package it into an engineering solution. But no, he was in my lab. I mean, we were talking. Tony Bell was there at the same time. They were in the same room together talking to each other. Tony Bell used entropy for creating an algorithm for independent component analysis, right? And so Paul went off and created an entropy algorithm for face recognition, face detection. All right, so let's see. We're back to the history here. So we're in the mid-1980s. There's backpropagation gets invented, and there are a few early applications of neural nets. And then my impression was, it was, I mean, not that much happened. I mean, the big breakthrough was 2011, 2012. But what was happening in the period from like mid-1980s to that time?
Right. Okay. What happened was that although they look promising, the networks were too small to solve a really difficult, complex problem like image recognition. Databases weren't big enough, and so what had to happen really is that there had to be a lot of exploration of network architectures and ways of eking out a little bit better performance. And I'll give you one example. So every year, pretty much on a clockwork, Jeff would call me up and say, "Terry, I figured out how the brain works." And he would tell that to other people. We compare stories. But I remember once he called up and he said, we can get 10% better performance out of backpropagation. And I said, patent it, because that's going to be valuable someday. And it turned out to be something called dropout. And so here's how it works, which is really interesting, because it turns out to be what we see in the brain too. Instead of assuming that the weights are going to be fixed, what you do is on every batch of inputs that you're training, epochs they're called, you drop out half the weights in the network. You cancel it to zero. And then you do backprop. And then in the next epoch, you wipe out a different random set. And that improves the performance and the learning process by 10%, which is amazing. And a lot of reasons for it. Interestingly, it turns out that the synapses in your cortex, right? You've got a lot of them, like 1 million billion of them, are probabilistic. That is to say, on any given input, the probability that you have any output at all is only about 10-20%. So, again, the brain is filled with these tweaks and little improvements on algorithms to make everything much more efficient. And we gradually are discovering that. as we explore these network models. And it took like decades to just by brute force trying out different things. For example, I'll give you another example. This is Jan LeCun convolutional neural network. So there were a lot of things that he had to do to make it work, which like one of the things was that he did something called pooling, where you had say a lot of feature detectors, say so vertical edges that were pooled across space. And then he used that as a way for then creating a little bit of spatial invariance for the next layer. Well, that's called a complex cell in the visual cortex. And that's something Hubel and Wiesel discovered back in 59 or 62 was their classic paper, J. Physial. And so what happened was that Jan would systematically discover things like that, like normalization, like, before you pass it on to the next layer, why don't you normalize the activity level so they all have the same average level, and so that you're not saturating when you go up. And again, that's what inhibitory neurons are, negative feedback in the cortex. So basically, Jan converged through just trial and error with many different things to the architecture of the visual cortex. Now, the difference is that the neuroscientists knew it was there, but they didn't know why it was there. Right? They didn't know computationally what the complex cell was doing or what the inhibitory cells are doing. But Jan actually converged, and for computational reasons, for those particular features. And now we can go back and then look at the cortex and say, well, what else is there that we don't understand that might also be useful? So there was a back and forth going on back then between the computational neural networks, and that's continued, and it's actually blossomed, which is within the last 5 or 10 years. There's been a tremendous amount of flow of ideas and algorithms back and forth.
But so those things like dropout, for example, that wasn't invented for neurophysiological reasons. That was invented as a kind of algorithm hack.
Oh, exactly. No, Jeff is brilliant. I mean, he's a genius at coming up with brilliant hacks that, and often are ones that nature was there first, right? Jeff, is
okay. So you now must have the laundry list of the 25 hacks nature has discovered, of which the Jeff Hintons and Jan LeCuns of this world have only discovered 10 or something.
I would say that's less than that. Probably there are many others. And I say that because I look at the brain, and what I see is not one giant network. I see dozens and dozens of different kinds of networks in different brain areas solving different problems very efficiently. And we're just scratching the surface right now with regard to principles that we can extract from the brain. I think the brain will be a source of inspiration for decades to come.
But so we're now. But by the way, when you were doing that talk, was that was on a VAX type computer? Is that right? Is that
it was a Ridge computer, which was a knockoff of a VAX 780.
I remember the Ridge, the 32-bit. It was an impressive 32-bit computer. I had one.
The size of a washing machine. And because I was a presidential young investigator at this award, I got a 50% discount. So I bought two.
Yeah.
I had more computer power in my lab than the entire computer science department, running one of the 780s.
Right. Yeah, I remember that. I had one of these Ridge computers at Institute for Advanced Study. Yes, it had that and Sun workstations. Those were my two things. The Ridge was a very strange creature. I think it had some RISC architecture technology in it.
It had, very cores. I think it was really primitive.
Anyway, but okay, but so that was the machine, and that was okay. But so you're saying in this period from the mid-80s up until 2010 or so, this was a time when, I mean, to me, I would hear about these neural net innovations, and I was just looking. I collected all these papers over the course of decades about neural nets, and I never really did anything with them, and I never, it never seemed to be going anywhere. But there was a group of people that continued, I guess, to pursue these things, and that group, I mean, it was a fairly small group, as I mean, it wasn't accumulating a lot more people.
I know all of them because I was one of them. and,
Yes.
And like I said, the NeurOps meetings continued to go on for like 30 years and during that period. But the core of the people were part of a group that was funded by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CIFAR it's now called. CIFAR.
Is that why Jeff Hinton went to Canada?
He went to Toronto. No, this was, well, maybe it was part of the reason, but no, he went to Toronto. He wanted, the main source of support for computer science at that time was DARPA, and Jeff was at Carnegie Mellon and felt awkward taking military money, so he went up to Toronto. And
so was there a particular person in Canada who really believed in this kind of direction?
Not really. Okay, no, what was the CIFAR group was a very interesting group because they would put together a project. And so you had to have some interesting project and you apply for support. And it wasn't enough to actually do a big DARPA project. What it was to give you some salary relief and maybe have a postdoc, right? But there's a core of about 10 people. And Jan LeCun, Yoshua Bengio, and a bunch of others. But I was on the scientific advisory board, so I would go to all their meetings. And so I saw this happen over a period of like 10, it actually went on for longer, 20 years. It was, originally it was focused on vision. And that's when Jeff was a director. And then when Yoshua took over, it was focused on language. But the beauty of it was that it was a group that would get together regularly. We had summer schools. We had, and Jeff, by the way, spent most of that time working on Boltzmann machines because he really felt that was where the real breakthrough was going to occur because it was just had a beautiful theory behind it. It wasn't just a engineering hack. But the beauty was that as the GPUs were a dividing line between the old neural network performance and the new, because literally within a year you could enhance, because the architecture, as you know, for doing graphics is large matrix operations, right, with vectors. And so that you had multiple cores, right? So you could within a space of a few years you could jump 1 or 2 orders of magnitude in the size of the network that you could learn. And that suddenly broke through this threshold for actually solving world-class problems in vision, speech recognition, language, and so forth. So that was a phase transition. And here's why. Okay, ImageNet was a huge database of tens of millions of images with tens of thousands of categories. Right. Even obscure ones like all kinds of different birds and flowers and so forth that most humans probably wouldn't recognize.
Yeah, and lots of shocking ones. I looked at it. It had some. It had a certain. It was a curiously curated thing. Yes,
but it didn't matter what the categories were because it just needed something that would scale everything up, and progress that was being made in the field was like with the labor intensive method we discussed earlier was about maybe 1% decrease in the error per year, but the error was huge. Like it was like the performance is like 20% correct.
And this was there were these competitions every year.
The ImageNet competitions, right? So what happened was that using convolutional neural networks, these 2 graduate students in Jeff's lab lowered the error in ImageNet by 20%. So it's like 20 years of research overnight, as far as computer vision was concerned. And and by the way that the community works is all with benchmarks, right? And so if you can do better than the existing algorithms, that you can't compete. So they literally phase transition over. Maybe it took a year or so until everybody was now using these CNNs.
But so this was the AlexNet thing, is that right?
Yes, that's right. Alex Kushevsky was one of his graduate students.
And so, I mean, I think there's a story that's told that it was just like, well, they left it training for a month and they forgot about it, and then came back and found out that it had been successful. Is that story true, or is that an apocryphal story?
I'll have to ask Jeff that. I've never heard that story, but it's I think it sounds like it could be apocryphal. By the way, as you're talking about apocryphal stories, I once heard a story that the first DARPA grant from MIT was to build a robot that played ping pong. And when they got it, they discovered they forgot to ask money for, to write a vision program. And I have always thought that was apocryphal because, but at the very same meeting at Dartmouth where I met Marvin Minsky, I asked him, I said, I heard the story and I just like to find out whether or not it's true. And he says, you're wrong. We did not give it to a graduate student as a project, summer project. We gave it to undergraduates.
Okay. To solve the vision part of it.
Yeah, that's right. So that's how, and I actually found an AI memo to that effect.
But by the way, had DARPA supported a lot of neural net stuff? I don't remember DARPA being deeply involved in neural nets. Seems like that kind of thing.
No. DARPA was funding Marvin Minsky to write a computer program that could play ping pong.
Right, but not using
AI lab, the AI lab, and it had nothing to do with neural networks.
Right, I mean,
they were going to build a robot, and they were going to write programs that did vision, and they were going to assign a graduate student as a summer project to write a computer program, the vision program. That was how naive they were about the complexity of the problem. And even after that, that was probably in like 50, early like 60, in the 56, 50, probably 1960 or so. And and just think about it, right? Even in the 80s, people were still struggling in computer vision.
Sure. Right. But I mean, that was a different tradition. That was the symbolic tradition of AI, which, I think, well, this is a long discussion, but probably not for, but so coming back to, okay, so GPUs, when did GPUs come on the scene? I'm trying to remember. That must have been.
Let's see, 2000, around 2000 or so.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit later.
But so then there was a 10-year period before there was sort of breakthrough work done in neural nets based on GPUs.
Oh, no. No, I'm sorry. I was thinking about 2010. I would have guessed. They picked it up very early. I remember Jan LeCun at one of the CFAR meetings saying that he has a graduate student who was hacking, and that it looked very promising. And so as soon as they got that up and running, everybody in neural networks, realized that this was like exactly the right architecture for the problems that we have. There was a CUDA programming language that you could use, so you didn't have to microcode it. It was very efficient.
Right, but so I mean, the sequence that there was the ImageNet breakthrough in and then.
By the way, actually, it wasn't. That was the big public breakthrough, but there was a breakthrough earlier at Microsoft. Jeff sent one of his graduate students there to help them with speech recognition, and apparently it really was working much more effectively than their program, which was based on hidden Markov models. There was a bound-Welch algorithm.
So when was Jan LeCun's Linnet stuff? That was that?
That was actually much earlier. That's when he was at Bell Labs at Holmville. There was a group there, Larry Jackal and a bunch of other, Sarah Soya, let's see, who was the other one? There was just a really powerful group of engineers there that were solving these practical problems, and Jan was one of them. Isabel Guillon was there at the time.
So this was handwritten digit recognition. They had
this database from MNIST. It was from some post office, I think in Rochester, New York, and it was they had thousands and thousands of zip codes,
which had been hand keyed.
We're talking like 700 pixels.
Right. But the way that letters were being routed at that point, people were keying in. They saw a human would see the zip code, and then they would put in whatever, this invisible ink or something. They would actually put the data on what the actual zip code.
Yeah, they had to, because the human being was the only image processing system that could do that at the time.
Right.
And I think that there were competing systems which weren't as accurate, but
so how had those guys at Bell Labs? How had they gotten into neural nets, and what was
I know it's interesting. They were I think Larry Jackal, for example, was actually he worked on chips. He built chips, and so there was a whole group of people at Caltech and at Holmdel and a bunch of other places that realized that we could speed things up even further by special purpose hardware. And so they were designing chips that could do these things.
Was that a kind of Carver-Mead related enterprise, or was that not? Was his effort yet a separate branch?
Which branch?
But the Carver-Mead.
Oh, Carver-Mead. No. Carver, the neuromorphs. I was one of the founders of the Telluride workshop, neuromorphic engineering workshop. So I know everybody, and they were. Caltech was one of the hotbeds for the neural network people. In fact, Dmitry Saltras was there, who was trying to build the first generation of optical neural network. And now it's making a comeback because it's actually a very practical solution to a lot of these.
Right. When was that?
That was in the 80s, probably, about the time the 87 was the first NeurIPS meeting. And then it was probably,
So it was after I left Caltech in 83. So I thought
okay,
I knew
you missed that. Oh, and the CNS program. So they had a computation of neural systems, which was jointly with biology, and they had a lot of people building things, neuro chips and things. But Caltech was way ahead of a lot of other engineering institutions, which were still back in the dark ages. They didn't understand how the importance of learning. They didn't understand multi-layer networks.
But so this group at Bell Labs, that Holmdel, where had they come from? I mean, I think Jan LeCun was a physicist originally. Is that not correct?
He comes from I think more of an engineering background. Larry Jackal was a physicist. So I think, well, I might be wrong, but I thought Jan was coming from computer science. But he had a version of backprop that he came up with on his own for his thesis. And I remember I met him in Les Zouches, which is a physics summer school. Yeah. And it was wonderful because here's this poor guy. He came from a good school, but isolated, right? There was nobody around him at all to talk to at all. And he came to this workshop, and he was so happy to talk to somebody.
And what was the workshop about? I mean, there was, because Les Zouches is a very physicist organized.
Well, no, it was neural networks are pretty hot at the time. I mean, I think it was already past, the Hopfield network was already in vogue, and it was physicists were I have to say that physicists, I think, had the right way of thinking about the problem, but I think here's what was missing in physics was that you solve a problem in physics by writing down the Hamiltonian and solving the equations, right? I mean, magnetism, whatever.
I'm not sure that's. I don't consider that a universal.
I'm not saying that that's all the problems, but I'm saying that you have a Hamiltonian for the hydrogen atom, right? And you have to quantum mechanics. You solve it with quantum mechanics. Okay, but what no one in physics, at least not mainline physics, thought about was, what if you are able to change the Hamiltonian, right? Now, what if you have power over physics, power over the Hamiltonian? What could you build, right? So that's a different mindset, because now that's what learning is all about, is how you can implant the complexity of the world into your brain through learning. And that's like, letting nature kind of adapt to the environment.
That's an interesting interpretation there. I mean, obviously the physicists around the early 1980s were all interested in spin glasses, where you would have, this whole pattern of different, weights effectively in the spin glass. So your claim is that basically they never really imagined the idea of having, that people, like even the early simulated annealing stuff was about finding energy minima in spin glasses.
Right. So the spin glasses, people would study random networks. So you could prove analytic solutions to what the landscapes look like. But Yeah, and actually Hopfield, one of his contributions was to show that how do you put the local minima in? It turns out you do it with Hebbian learning. You take the vector, right? And then you take the cross product and then put those into the weights. And that does it.
That was the original Hopfield network idea, if I remember correctly.
That's it. That's how Hopfield created the local minima, the tractor states.
Right. It's an interesting perspective that the thing missed by the physicists was that you could change the weights, so to speak.
Right. That's right. At your will.
Right. But so then we get to 2010, and basically GPUs come in, and one starts to be able to do all sorts of and basically then you're basically saying that given GPUs, you could make the old neural net ideas work. Is that a fair?
You could jump. Okay, so Moore's law doubles every 18 months, right? So how long?
It stopped a while ago. It was supposed to. It didn't work. It hasn't been working for a while.
Okay, but it's something like,
No, that was the original Moore's law.
Let's just say a year. Okay, let's just say a year. It doubles every year. So to get to 100, you would have to do like 2 to the 6.
Give or take.
Yeah, 6, 2 to the 6. So I guess that's like 6 years, but 10, with the 18-month Moore's law. So it's like a decade. It's like jumping a decade into the future, right? And that is a major kind of leap into a larger scale. And by the way, we don't really quite understand what determines. By the way, what was the speech recognition, vision, and language all made this transition within about 5 years, less than 10 years. In other words,
they happened at different times, right? I mean,
they happened at different times because people were working on the problem at different times, and they didn't all have the same access to the tools that the Google had and so forth. So for the transformers, but the reality, I think, is that it may be something similar to what happened in nature. So very, very few things scale up. Very few algorithms scale up the way that brains have, and also these large language models and deep neural networks. So if you look at the size of primate brains, which are on average per body weight much bigger, the cortex has expanded even faster in terms of the amount of neurons and the connectivity within the cortex. In fact, in the case of the human brain, it's gotten, to get it inside of a reasonable volume, you've got to have these convolutions, right? You kind of you're squeezing it in, right? And if you look at the cortex, although there are differences from area to area, that uses the same 6 layers and inputs and outputs, and so it is better. Something was good about that architecture, which wasn't the case with a lot of other parts of the brain, like the amygdala or the hippocampus. Hippocampus actually just stayed the same. It didn't expand, even though it's really important, but it didn't. But as you add more computing into the cortex, at some point you start getting capabilities that weren't there before, like language processing, right? And so it's in computer science, I've learned that you have to look at how each algorithm scales. And the worst is NP complete, in which case it's exponential. But even polynomial kills you at a certain point, because it's going to eventually use up all the resources. Beauty of these networks is they scale as n, right? The number of weights. It's linear.
Well, not yet. I mean, the learning part of it with backpropagation is more like an n-squared story. I mean, the actual backpropagation process.
No, I'm talking about, I'm running it in real time, just the inference part.
Yeah, okay.
And that's all that matters, really, in terms of using it to solve problems. The offline learning and everything is you're right. It takes an enormous amount of energy and so forth. And eventually we'll figure out how to do it online, but not yet. Like they call it lifelong learning. But there is a story here, because if you now build the special purpose hardware. Nature built the hardware so that it could take an order n problem with n weights and actually build all the weights so that they're physical. It becomes an order 1 problem, right? You could run it in real time. You don't have to simulate it. It just runs. And that is very, very, very few algorithms can scale that way. And now there's a huge push for building special purpose machine learning, digital machine learning, and neuromorphic engineering. It takes it one step further and takes it down to building special purpose networks, which are based on the same biophysics that your neurons are based on.
But so if you look at the biological, because I mean, in the actual history of neural networks, there's 2012 big progress in image recognition. Then there's, I don't know when, the speech to text. That must have been, when was that? That was like 4 or 5 years ago now. And now large language models and so on. And I'm curious whether that recapitulates anything that you see in actual history of biological evolution.
Oh, well,
I mean, trilobites.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right that the transition for transformers came about 10 years later. Not quite. I mean, it was about 3 years ago, so it was less than 10 years. But it required a much bigger network than ImageNet, AlexNet, and speech recognition. So you're right. It wasn't all at the same time. You're right, but I was exaggerating. It occurred over a time period where things were expanding very rapidly in terms of the sizes of the networks. Primarily at places like Google and Microsoft. But maybe for all we know, it's going to continue, right? It's not going to stop. It's because you just add more of these GPUs, or now they have the TPUs and Google and other special purpose chips that are going to make it even faster and cheaper. And eventually, I did this calculation. So how many? 175 billion weights in GPT-3, right? So that's how much cortex does that correspond to? It corresponds to the number of synapses under a square centimeter of cortex, and you have about 1,000 square centimeters in your brain of cortex.
But so wait a minute. So for each neuron, so there are like 100 billion neurons in the brain, and each neuron has what, 10,000 connections or something?
Yeah, roughly 10 to the 14 total. Yeah, there's 10 to the
that will be only 1,000.
10 to the 11th neurons, and 10 to the 11th neurons, and about 10 to the 4th connections each. So that's like 10 to 15. Okay. It's not quite that high, but between 10 to 14, 10 to 15. But so that's like a million billion synapses.
Right.
And so a couple, the 10 to the now there's up to 1 trillion. I think the networks have 1 trillion of these weights in them. So that's 10 to the 12th. So there's still like a factor of 1,000 away from just the raw storage capacity. Although a synapse is much more sophisticated than a single weight. I was telling you the complexity is more like a dynamical system. So you have to add another factor of 10 or something.
On the other hand, the clock speed is an awful lot lower in a brain than it is in a.
Okay. Now, is that a feature, or is that a bug or a feature? Okay. So here is again, digital computers go really fast, and they have buffers, and they can do things faster than we can. But if you have a network that solves problems in real time, you don't need those buffers, or very little. You just have a little bit of working memory. And the idea, though, is that the time scale for processing in the brain matches the time scale of the world. You don't have to go faster than that.
Well, that's defined. The timescale of the world is defined by the timescales we think about. I mean, there are plenty of things in physics that happen on much shorter timescales than the ones humans are aware of. I mean, the speed of light is very fast.
No, though. Actually, things are happening at synapses at the microsecond level. No, I'm talking about behavior of the whole brain, right? In other words, 100 milliseconds to recognize something. There's a lot of things flying around inside, to do that. So yeah, but I guess, but even that is now millisecond we're talking about. You know, if the synapses have time constants of a millisecond, the fast ones. There's some that are even much slower. Okay, well, but you know, the world works on a millisecond time scale. You know, you catch a ball and you have to judge things with a millisecond time scale. And
I think this is a self-fulfilling loop. I mean, it works on millisecond timescales because that's the timescale of our thought processes.
You know, all I'm saying, by the way, okay, it is possible for nature to go much faster, but at great expense. For example, the giant axon in the squid, it's a millimeter in diameter, just to show you. The reason is that the larger the diameter, the faster you can get an action potential. And the squid has an escape response. So when it is in danger, what happens is it suddenly activates that nerve, and then it like shoots off. It's a jet of water that is now released to make the thing just scoot off faster than other fish, or you know, whatever is whales or whatever are going to can go in a random direction. So with that, and then there are other things. For example, your ability to detect the location of a sound, and it turns out that you can do that because nature can do comparisons of time differences between the two ears in the microsecond range. Okay, so if nature needs to do that, yeah, it can engineer with the existing circuits, but it only does that when it's really pushed to the wall, where having that can save your life, or it can give you some capability that is important for your survival. So that's, you know, and I think that it's a beautiful thing that the thing works in real time, and that it's engineered to do that. And by the way, again, you can do these fancy things, but at the great expense in terms of volume, the amount of material you need, and also the energy you have to put in. So nature has taken the low road and figured out what's the least amount of energy I could use. You know, if it could solve the problem in a millisecond, then let's go with a millisecond, right? Or, you know, muscles, even slower.
Right. I mean, you could summarize that by who needs computers when you have brains?
I didn't say that, but I agree.
but so if you look at I mean, for example, let's take ChatGPT. What's the next stage? I mean, so if you're right that corresponds to, you know, what we have right now with 1 trillion weights is, you know, 1 square centimeter of cortex. How big is the total area of the cortex?
About 1,000 square centimeters.
Okay.
It's about the size of a dinner napkin.
Okay. And does any other creatures have bigger ones, but they also have much larger body weights? Right?
It turns out that the brain scales as the 3/2 power of the body weight, and that's because that's the surface area of the body, which is the receptors, and everything scales according to that.
I see.
Receptors.
So a whale has a lot of nerves coming in from all of its different flippers and so on that have to find a place in the.
But that's the first approximation, and like I say, there are exceptions. Like the primates are on a they still scale with body weight, but on a slightly different line in that space.
Okay,
we'll go back to your question, which is, you know, what's the where are we headed, and what's missing? Okay, so first of all, I made a list. I have if anybody's interested, an archive paper that's coming out next month in Neurocomputation on, it's called Large Language Models and the Reverse Turing Test. And if you're curious about the reverse Turing test, take a look. Wait, Stephen passed the reverse Turing test.
Oh, what's that? Wait a minute. What is the reverse Turing test?
Well, it turns out different people come away thinking different things. Some people come away saying, this is amazing, I can't believe it. Other people say, it makes mistakes. This is terrible. I mean, it's not like humans that don't make mistakes, right?
Right.
And what I do is actually have about 3 different dialogues with 3 different people who range in terms of their conclusions about whether they're talking to something that is incredibly intelligent or something that's incredibly dumb. And there's a range in between. It's a huge debate out there. I mean, it's going on and on. Now it's reached the public, and people are going off in different directions. But the reverse Turing test is the following. So I came to the conclusion that what you get out of it is what you put in. So if somebody asks intelligent questions, you get intelligent answers. But if you ask stupid questions, you get stupid answers. And the reason is that the GPT-3 has access to the world's database, which includes the world's smartest people and the world's stupidest people. And it takes on whatever persona it is presented.
Well, you're saying if your prompt is characteristic of one type of person, then you're going to be sampling the part of its training set.
It will look through its training set and say, is there a person like this out there? Yeah, there are a lot of people out there saying stupid things, so that must be what I'm expected to do, is to be a stupid person.
Well, alternatively, it's kind of like what is it? These kind of echo chamber type things. You're saying basically
yes.
that it's the perfect.
It's reflecting. It's mirroring the quality of your prompt. It mirrors the answer back with the same level of complexity.
Assuming that the ocean of what's out there on the web and in books and so on that it's been able to sample, that assuming that you are somewhere in that ocean, the prompt you produce will, the fish that are around that part of the ocean will be what you'll get back from the prompt you give.
Exactly.
If you're somewhere that isn't even in the ocean, then it's a different story.
Exactly. So, that's wonderful. That's a wonderful metaphor. And so that's the idea, is that you have this ocean was filled with all kinds of different creatures, really smart ones, really stupid ones, and everything in between. And GPT has to, when they get a query, they got to figure out, where in the ocean am I going to go? Where are there discussions like this, that I've experienced before? And if it's a really interesting question, deep question, where a lot of people have deep thoughts, it will go there and mine that part of the ocean, right? As for responses, right?
But so I'm curious. I mean, one of the things, it is, apart from its outer loop, it is a feed-forward type network. And so there are severe limitations on what it can expect to compute. And I guess one question would be, if you talk about learning as a universal, meta algorithm, so to speak, one of the things that, we're not particularly good at it, but we do manage to learn things which are non-trivial kind of looping procedures, so to speak. Is it obvious because the learning methods used for GPT-3 and so on are, as we've just been discussing, they're very classical learning methods in the history of neural networks. I mean, is that how does one learn loops? How does one learn things that are more complicated than kind of feed forward kinds of things?
Okay, so you brought up the issue of what is it that the transformer is learning. It's basically taught to predict the next word in a sentence.
Right.
That's it. And once you've created the internal representations, which take advantage, by the way, of anything possible, including the semantics, the syntax, all of the relationships in terms of higher order statistics that might be relevant for different the text that it's encountered to solve that problem. It can now be used to generate, as a generative network. It can generate new text that is really original, by the way. It's not copying. People think, oh, it's cutting and pasting from all of those things. No, it would never be able to do that. Never in a million years. These networks generalize from the examples it's given. It's given examples that it may never have gotten before anywhere in the world.
Right. But the fact is, if you give it a big piece of a well-known document, it will continue verbatim because it will have enough information that's encoded. I mean, basically will have successfully encoded in its weights, that precise statistical continuation.
Well, I would be surprised if it was a perfect verbatim, but yes, it would be able to replicate something that was well established, well known. But I'm pretty sure if you just take a random sentence from a random blog in the internet.
No, I think you're right. I think what happens is if you're out in the corners of the distribution where there's very little support out in the corner of the distribution, and there's only one thing out there, it's going to be something. It's going to look very much like that thing. But if you're in a place where there's a quite high population of things, it's going to do all kinds of different stuff.
No, that's my intuition too. Yeah, that it does that to compress. It has to compress all that data that's in the high density regions. And by the way, it's not good at extrapolating. That's one of the problems. Is how do you go beyond the text that you have and look at out of distribution? It's called. It's a very hot topic in machine learning right now.
Right, but I mean, in fact, the number of weights is very comparable to the number of tokens of training data. I mean,
that's another one of the things that we were told back in the 80s that were underpowered, that they would over, that the network would memorize basically, which didn't happen actually, even though we had relatively small databases. We had regularization techniques like weight decay, which helped, but actually now people actually have found that there are rules about how much data you need, but it's much less than the complexity the complexity equations that came from statistics, which would have predicted much larger databases, which are based on wrong assumptions though about the high dimensional spaces.
Well, I mean, my impression is, if you're trying to learn some, wiggly mathematical function, you might actually need quite a lot of examples. It turns out, I suspect, that there's more regularity in language than people knew, and that's why it's possible to learn, possible to represent that with a.
That's exactly right. And that's what these networks are designed to do, is to pick up regularities that may not be apparent, but allow you to compress and maybe are able to interpolate within the complex function that you have. And by the way, with the reason why deep learning when you have many layers is useful is that the way that you do that is by starting out with trying to understand what's happening locally, in terms of small amounts of data coming in, and then gradually build up larger, more abstract representations as you go up. So that becomes easier then to generalize as you go at higher and higher levels.
Right, but if you stick a probe inside a deep learning network and you say, what's going on in here, you'll get all kinds of complicated stuff coming out. If you stick a probe inside a brain and say, what's going on in here, you get all kinds of complicated stuff coming out.
That's right.
In either case, do you think that there will be or there can be sort of a human understandable theory of what you're seeing?
It's too early to tell, but I know that some really smart mathematicians are working on that problem as we speak. And we already have an indication that there is going to be a real insight coming from brain recordings. So, we just went through the numbers. The brain has, the billions and billions of synapses and so forth. And so you might think that this high dimensional space is somehow, you need all of it at the same time, to be able to process. But now we have been able to sample from, say, 100,000 routinely now at the same time from multiple brain areas. What we've discovered is that if you have an animal doing a task, relatively simple task in terms of discrimination or judging, making a decision about whether to go right or left, but nonetheless, for animals, right, that's important, and they learn how to do that. But under all of the cases that we have studied so far, it looks as if the part of the space of all the activities and all the neurons that are actually carrying the information that you need is a very low dimensional subspace. Out of all the billions and billions of dimensions out there, on any given trial, you're only using typically 4 to 6 dimensions. So that means that embedded in this very high dimensional space are these little tunnels that are carrying your behavior along and a lot of them are very well greased because you use them over and over again, right? Those are the motor activities that you learn, for example, when you play tennis. That's why you get very, very accurate, because you can be very precise with that tunnel. But the actual geometry of that space is very difficult to understand. And I'm working with a Fields medalist, actually, Stanislav Smirnov, who's actually gotten interested in that problem, and he is a very, very smart. I don't know if you know him. Very, very.
Yeah,
smart.
I do know him. I do know him. He's one of his other activities is studying pigmentation patterns on various kinds of
Yes,
creatures.
and he was here just a few weeks ago and gave us a beautiful talk on that. It was a cover article in Nature. It was how the lizard got its spots.
Right. It was using cellular automata and things to study these. It's been on my list to drop in Zurich and see the vivarium with the actual creatures, so to speak.
Yes. Yes, no, it's fascinating. The whole story is just amazing. But that's biology,
right? But so what is not obvious is when you say it's a low dimensional space, by even describing that and talking about it in terms of variables and dimensions and so on, you're kind of assuming a certain kind of mathematical structure, which is far from obvious to me, at least, really exists there. I mean, in other words, if I started talking about Turing machines and saying what they do and talking about what dimensional spaces they live on, it will be a very bizarre way of talking about those essentially computational processes. So it's an interesting claim that you can think about things in terms of sort of geometrical continuous mathematics like that.
Well, it's, I guess, it was a great surprise for me and for many, many others when people started reporting that. Dave Tank did these experiments in Princeton. What he did was it took an enormous amount of computer time to do this. What you have to do is you have to follow the whole. You record from 100,000 neurons, and what you do is you are now reducing the dimensionality of that very high dimensional space, and you're mapping as this population shifts in the actual brain, you're following it in this low dimension transform space, right? As you go through, and you've got to do you have to follow it, and you have to do incremental PCAs and so forth. It's very crude, but now people are finding many much better algorithms to do that. And so it's all about one of the big ironies of machine learning is that it was inspired originally NeurIPS by the brain. Now it's all those algorithms are being used to analyze data from the brain.
Yes.
And and so that's why we're using machine learning to look at the geometry of these spaces, and it's very difficult to have any intuition about what's happening in these spaces. You really have to use these tools and machine learning to do that.
Right. No, I mean, look, I looked at the dimension reduction of how GPT-3 completes sentences, which is, so the question is there sort of a semantic law of motion that you get from kind of how it is completing things in language, how it is moving through that space.
Right.
It's a bit of a mess so far, but it doesn't mean there isn't something to be found.
Well, it's a mess if you expect it to be something that you can imagine. See, we're really very unimaginative creatures because we live in a three-dimensional space with time. And now the brain is living in this billions of dimensions, and the properties of high dimensional spaces is very, very counterintuitive. A lot of these theorems don't make any sense.
Well, in fact, the 2012 breakthrough, in a sense, as I understand it, it was a story of people thought, maybe this is correct, maybe not, that gradient descent and so on, finding that minimum loss configuration would be something where, if somebody said, well, let's go to a higher dimensional space, most people like me would have said it's going to be more difficult in a higher dimensional space. But that turned out not to be true.
Just the opposite.
Right.
Yeah, the bigger the space, the easier it is to find a solution. And now what's happening is very interesting, because it's possible once you have that solution, you take the output from this very large network and train up a smaller network to give you the same output.
And so you can distill it. It's called distillation.
Right.
But you need the big network to find it in the first place, because if you start from the small network, you'll never make it. You don't have enough degrees of freedom. So that's
you're also getting training data and so on.
Yeah, it's the nature of how you need the extra dimensions in order to explore the space efficiently. The other thing, by the way, the big difference was between the people back in the 80s who were telling us that it'll never work because you get these local minima. Your gradient descent in non-convex spaces is just it's a non-starter, and we were told that we're going to be overfitting. We don't have enough data, right? And that's coming from classical statistics, where you have small models and you're trying to find the optimal set of parameters for that model, a single set of parameters.
Right.
And that assumption, if you just say, okay, I don't care how many parameters or what their values are, I just want to solve the problem, right? That throws you into a much higher dimension. And if you repeat the same learning process over and over, you get different networks, which have roughly the same performance, but they're all different in terms of the weights between all the units, right? You can't map one into the other, which means that there's a degeneracy in the number of solutions. There are many, many, many possible solutions depending on where you start in that weight space. And that's wonderful, because it means that the bigger the space, the faster you're going to get to one of those locations.
Right. I mean, right. But the classical statistics, the failure of people to estimate, all these questions about, you've got this problem you're trying to solve. Maybe it's playing some game, maybe it's generating language. The thing that was always confusing to me is one didn't know how hard those problems were. Like, I remember, Gerald Tesauro, you remember him?
Yes.
He worked in the center that I had at University of Illinois.
He was at the Institute, I think, with you, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Yeah, he was a postdoc with me.
And he came.
But, I never understood the work he was doing. He worked with you, which is great, but I never understood what he was doing.
Well, he did something really amazing. Okay, I'll tell you. Very simple. We wanted to pick a game for which we could show that this approach could outdo humans, right? Because that's how you get people's attention. So we picked backgammon. Backgammon is interesting because it has a very high fan-out ratio, and it's probabilistic because you throw the dice. And so we got amassed a large data set from books, from games that are published, and then we brought in people who were, masters level, not grandmaster, but people who were good. They just played many, many games. We accumulated a big database, and we trained up a Fedora network. And again, we didn't have a large network, so it had to be only one layer, I think, or maybe 2 layers. But it played, surprisingly, not a high level, but it played at a good amateur level, right? It was playing the game, and it learned how to play it on its own. Now, here's what happened. Now, that's when he was at the Institute. Now he went. His first job was at IBM Thomas J. Watson, and it was there that he made a brilliant shift away from just training it to take we trained it to take the board and to predict the value of that board, so that you knew what move is going to be the best move. So what he did was he had the network play itself over and over again. And of course, at the beginning, it's just random, and eventually one is able to win the game by just random chance. But then every time one side wins, all the weights are updated in that value function, and it keeps going back and forth. And he used temporal difference learning, which is a reinforcement learning algorithm for updating the weights, and backprop for the value function. But ultimately, the whole thing got better and better and better, and it got to the point where there was nobody there that could beat it. So he had to get some grandmaster from New York, Roberti, I think is his name, who wrote books on the best moves, for backgammon players. It came in, and he said that, well, first of all, he said, this is better than any program I've ever played before. It's really playing at a very high level. It won a significant number of the games. I don't know what maybe 34% or something.
And he said, but it made moves that I've never seen before anybody make. And he took them back to New York and played them out, and turned out that they were better than the human move, right? So that it was creative. It actually was able to discover new moves that no human had ever thought of before. But then, okay, because the computers were getting faster and playing more and more games, 1 million games, 2 million games, he came back and he said, this now has reached not just the grandmaster level, but it's probably a world champion. And if it played the world champion, it might even win. So that it was an achievement. And it was overshadowed when Go, using exactly the same self-play and reinforcement learning, but much more computer power, was able to beat the world champion in Go. That got the world's attention. I think Jerry should deserve much more credit for doing the equivalent thing with the computing power that was available to him at the time. He basically figured out how to make progress on games, and now it's really played out really well in terms of performance as the networks get bigger, more computing and so forth, that you can play more complex games. In fact, it got to the point where DeepMind was able to, it actually was able to bootstrap itself up without even knowing the rules of the game. I think it was able to reach a level where it beat Alpha Zero. No, it beat Alpha Go like 100 games to 0. It was called Alpha Zero, actually.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, for me, it was an interesting I chalk up my complete failure to understand the significance of Gerald Tesauro's work back in 87-ish time frame.
Right.
And part of the problem that I had was I had no idea how difficult playing backgammon is as a kind of computational problem. And so somebody could tell me, I remember when I happened to see the sort of first public demo of the DeepMind, playing 8-bit video games or something. And it was a sort of fairly small event. And somebody turns to me and says, well, how impressed are you at this? And I said, I have no idea, because I don't know how hard this problem is. And that was, which is the same statement you're saying the statistics folk were telling you, if you do all this stuff, you're going to overfit and so on. I think the difficulty is for these human-like tasks, it's very hard, at least, so far as I know, to really have an estimate of, how difficult is this? We have measures of difficulty, like, we've got for combinatorial problems, we have, computational complexity theory and NP problems and NP completeness, all those kinds of things. But for these more human-like problems, it's not obvious what the kind of what the human version of computational complexity theory is.
Well, in some way, if you have a network that solves the problem, that the complexity can't be more than that, whatever the resources are that you had to use.
But the question is, what does solve the problem mean? Because, for example, with ChatGPT, if the problem is write a high school level essay, then which is again a very fuzzy threshold of what does it mean to solve the problem.
Okay, there you go. So in other words, this is always a problem in AI, is that as soon as you solve a problem that couldn't be solved before, people will say, well, that's not AI. That's not general intelligence.
Eventually they'll stop saying that. we've been through so many iterations of that in the last 50 years. I have to believe that's eventually,
right. But your point is, what's the metric and how do we know how complex problems are? I think we're beginning to understand them, but it's not the metric we're going to use is not. It might be having to do with information theory or some sort, but I think
I don't think so, because this is presumably the mistake in thinking about language. People were thinking about Shannon style, Markov chain type things, and then that's not really a good representation of of all possible sentences one can say in combinations of letters. The ones that are meaningful are very
okay. So I think you're right, and here's the insight, and I think that so. So if you look at Go, it played itself 100 million times probably. Who knows? But if you just add up all of the moves, all the game positions in 100 million games, it's like maybe 100 billion. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But the total number of possible board positions is some Google plus, right? 10 to the 10 to the 10th or something. it's so giant that the number of training examples it was given was infinitesimal. It was measure zero on that whole set of all possible. Right. But the point is that under all circumstances that humans play, those random positions never occur, would never have ever occurred. And so somehow, in this very small subset, there are regularities that represent the complexity of the problem, the true complexity of the problem, not all the possible solutions, possible game positions. And intuitively, it's the same thing if I look at all possible images, right? So if you have a megapixel and each one has 10 gray levels, right? That's 10 to the 7th possible images.
Yeah, right. I mean,
10 to the million. No,
yeah,
that's right. 10 to a million, roughly.
Yeah, right.
And so that's a huge number. And the fact is that the ones that actually occur in the real world this is a very small fraction of all of those, right?
Right. The actual physics that we perceive is a tiny fraction of all of the, the images, the physics, etc. They're all tiny slices of what could be.
That's right.
And characterizing that, those slices and seeing what it takes, characterizing kind of what the contours of what is actually possible are.
That's right.
Is hard.
And that's geometry. That's geometry. In other words, the geometry in the images of all the images from the real world, and figuring out what's common with all of those images is what learning does for you. It pulls out something that is essential about real images.
Right.
From physics generated by physics.
The very assumption that there is geometry assumes things about sort of space and all those kinds of things. We should probably, I'm being reminded, we've been yakking on. We almost made it through the whole history from the last 100 years or something of neural nets.
But you haven't asked me about the future.
Well, I think that maybe we have to do that a different time.
We will. Okay.
I think, but let's see. I think there might be people here. Are there
questions? Yeah,
questions. We have some questions here. The question about Dennis Gabor's 1959. What's that?
What was it? 59 paper was it, or what was it?
Yeah. Electronic Inventions and their impact on civilization. First proposal of random circuits with weight tuning to learn a black box function. So I think Gabor had a bunch of stuff that came from sort of the optical holography type tradition.
Yeah, holography. That's a very interesting paper, and also is very, very relevant because remember I told you that the original perceptron, Frank Rosenblatt's perceptron, could only do linearly separable functions. Well, it turns out that he knew that, and so what he did was he put another layer of weights in between the input and the perceptrons units, and made them all random. So random projections. And now you know what he did. What he did there, which allowed him to solve more complex problems. But you know what he did was what we now call compressed sensing. In other words, you can map the original space into a big, a different space, in which it's possible now because the features you've created are kind of random features. And now those random features can be weighted in a way to solve a more complex problem. And there's a beautiful theory of this. It's called the Johnson-Lindenstrauss theorem. Very beautiful, which underlies all of these compressed sensing algorithms. And interestingly, there's evidence that it's used in the brain because there are parts of the brain which have that character in terms of random projections.
Huh. Okay. So the thing grows randomly.
Yeah.
And that randomness is, seeing through some
right.
random glasses, so to speak.
Now, the thing that I don't think Gabor had was the idea of learning algorithms. In other words, the closest thing that comes to mind is something called reservoir computing, where you start with a random network that has random activity patterns. And what you do is you train the output layer to do some function. So suppose you want to replicate some function. You can do that, and it works. It's amazing how well it works. It's a very.
So, what would be your expectation if I walked around wearing randomizing glasses, where every pixel, every pixel of input is randomized before it gets into my eyes, would I be able to untangle that?
Well, your visual system makes the assumption that it's not random, and so at the very first layer that goes to the brain, the ganglion cells, is making averages over a small region of the visual field. And so if the pixels that should be next to each other are not, then I think you'd end up with nothing. I think you just end up with garbage.
Yeah, right. Well, maybe if you're like if you're, because I mean it's learnt in early development, right?
Well, okay, modulo learning. In other words, where it might be learned, you might learn something at the highest level. In other words, it looks random at the input, but once you get to a higher level, maybe it's able to pick things out with the receptive fields are much bigger. That's possible. Well, Stephen, you should do the experiment. Put on your randomizing glasses and see how long it takes.
Yeah, right. Let's see how that works.
By the way, people have done. They flip the image, they turn it upside down, and that screws people. Right. But you can adapt to that. Interestingly. Right.
So let's see. We have a couple of other questions here. One is about Robert Hecht Nielsen's stuff. I never understood. I knew him, and I'm sure you did too.
Yes, he was in the engineering department here at UCSD. And he also had a company, HNC, which was early neural network company for credit card fraud detection.
Right. Right. I mean, that was a big early AI application. In fact, my first company ended up, after I was no longer much involved with it, ended up going and building what became, one of the standard systems for that.
Okay,
it seems to be an early.
He was an early adopter, but he was also very, very charismatic and had a big influence on the early movement, the neural network movement, because he was so enthusiastic and true believer. And so
what kind of neural nets was he using? I never quite got that straight. I mean, I talked to him a bunch.
I have to say,
was always a bit mysterious.
He was, if you pressed him, he would say, well, this is under patent or something. He has to patent it or something.
Yeah, right.
I've often wondered whether there was something there that I just didn't understand. And I've known several people who actually did have something, but they couldn't explain to me. But they were able to make things work. Mark Tilden, who builds robots for Huawei, is an engineer who he builds things out of parts that shouldn't work but do because of the motors, for example, that change resistance when they are run into a block and now the motor can't turn. That sets the robot off in a different direction, but it's not programmed. It just does it because the resistance has changed, and now so the circuit then flips. But this is that's another area. But I would love to, if anybody out there has actually read his papers and understands them, I'd love to talk to them, because I've never had enough energy to do that.
The question here about the Human Brain Project, and let's see. I mean, there are various brain simulation projects. I'm not quite sure what this one.
Okay, that was the European Union, and it was €1 billion over 10 years, and it was the brainchild of Henry Markram, who's an old friend of mine, a very good neurophysiologist, but he's also very charismatic and convinced the European Union that he was going to build, in 10 years, he was going to build a human brain.
I thought they were doing, I mean, I remember them, I remember meeting these people, and they were talking about, simulating a piece of a mouse hippocampus or some such other thing, which seemed like not very interesting.
That was their first step. They wanted to start small, but they eventually wanted to, create a simulation of the whole cortex.
Okay, so how far did they get?
There's a movie out which actually was a documentary over time, which shows how when they started out, they had these grand goals, and and gradually over time they began to realize how difficult the problem was. And even with so Henry started out with the Blue Brain Project, which was to simulate neural circuits. And his idea was, I just scale this up, right? I've got it working for the small network. I just have to scale it up, and I can create a network for the whole brain. And so my response to that was, Henry, let's just suppose, yeah, that's a difficult problem, but suppose you solve that problem. Suppose you build a really, and he believed in very, very accurate reconstructions of real neurons, not just the units, that have no internal structure, but your real neurons. I said, suppose you do that, and you turn it on, and suppose that lo and behold,
says hello to you.
It works, and you can talk to it and so forth. What have you learned? You haven't. It's as mysterious as the brain, right? Is that really the right goal?
Yeah, I remember when people were doing artificial evolution back in the early 80s, and they were observing that this is a simulation of some rainforest system or some such other thing, but it was an incredibly complicated setup. Again, same thing. You can observe. It's not obvious how you extract kind of the scientific narrative from that. Let's see. There are questions here. Zav is asking, Terry mentioned that current models are about 3 or 4 orders of magnitude less compute than the brain. How many orders of magnitude in algorithmic development of backpropagation and so on does he estimate that we are? So in other words, I think the question being asked is, are there algorithmic, do we know the correct algorithms, and it's just a question of scaling up the amount of compute, or do we not yet know the correct algorithms to reproduce the important aspects of the brain?
So my view is that there are many, many learning algorithms out there. If you give them the constraints that we have on the brain in terms of the units and the connectivity patterns, that ultimately they probably will all converge to the same small set of classes of solutions. And so backprop is just basically takes us there faster. In other words, humans require a whole, development of the brain. It goes through many stages of development and takes decades of experience to have an adult brain, right? And that's learning is going on during that entire time, right? But you can continue to learn even as an adult, maybe not as fast or as much. And so my goal is to figure out how that is done, even though it's slower and may take more resources, because if we understand that, then we'll actually, I think, have a chance to actually accomplish the Henry Markram's goal, right? In other words, we then, it really is going to be interesting, because the way that we're going to be able to instead of feeding data in with a shovel, what we're going to do is we're going to have these very large scale networks in the world absorbing data from the world with vision and audition, just like we do. And the brain will develop internally, the model, just like we do, if we've understood it properly. And so that is where we're going to have end up if you really want to understand how humans, because we should be able to analyze that process in the computer much better than we can with we can't. We don't have access to the whole human brain, right, for all the activity and all the neurons, but we do have access to all the units in GDP3. And so in principle, if we can't figure out how that works, then it's going to be really tough. But I think it should be possible.
Well, I mean, the question is whether there is a narrative scientific story of how it works.
Yes.
Because just saying you run the program and that's how it works is not what we have become used to as a kind of success in science.
Well, I think that I think it's too early to know whether there is a simple narrative. There are some people, I remember when I was young, people were saying, well, the brain is too complicated for the brain to understand itself. It's not possible, right? Some kind of, I've forgotten what the logic was. It has something to do with you can't, it's self-referential or something. You can't understand the complexity to understand it is much greater than the brain itself, right? And it's not going to fit in the brain. I think that's a bunch of hooey. Well, I think that, and Stephen, you've written very eloquently on this, which is the idea of physical laws being a compression of all of the complexity in the world, right?
Yeah, right. But
And
no,
so
look, I think the issue is, and we're now getting off into a quite different topic, and we probably should wrap up in a moment. But okay, we'll reserve it for another time. They're talking about the future, and let's see. Let's see. Yeah, there's a question here from It's All Gone Wrong, talking about neural nets can solve problems in ways that aren't intuitive to humans, and ending up with all kinds of issues. I think one of the things that to me is interesting and surprising is that you make these neural net systems and you ask them to extrapolate, basically, or even interpolate. But the fact that they will do that in a human-like way is not, it's not obvious that's going to work that way. I mean, that's telling one something scientifically quite important. The fact that it extrapolates, you know, a cat image as being a cat image and so on, and that's more or less like what humans do, is quite non-trivial. I don't know whether, I mean, you know, presumably the reason it works that way is because architecturally it is the same type of thing going on in the brain as is going on in the neural net. And, you know, for the alien, so to speak, that doesn't have the same, you know, the alien's version of optical character recognition, their, oh, that's really an A, might be very different from ours, because their, you know, their version of what counts as a small change might be very different.
Yeah, there was this wonderful movie in which aliens came and they couldn't communicate with us because they were using some kind of cloud-like things. Inception, I think. No, not Inception. What was it called?
Is this
I
the
think
Arrival
you were involved
movie?
in that, weren't you?
What's that? Yeah, there's probably Arrival. Yes, yeah, that was they had sort of visual, non-linear visual kinds of
That's right. It was a completely alien, literally. The coding.
Well, even if it was actually made in Photoshop, but yes, it was alien, conceptually alien. Right. They were very nicely drawn. Yeah. All right, I think we have a number of questions here about future kinds of things. I think we should probably, I should ask, I think we should probably reserve the future for another time, because I think we could go on talking about the future for the future is limitless. The history is at least bounded.
The history at least has a finite bound, but we've only touched on it, by the way. I mean, okay, so this is something that, you know, I lived through, and you're getting slightly different, or maybe even very, very different response. But I think, though, that we're converging, right? In other words, what you're just bringing up, which is that was the things that we didn't anticipate. I did not in any way anticipate what the neural networks were able to do. I had no idea how they would extrapolate and scale.
Right. Nor did I.
It was a big surprise, and in fact, it continues to surprise me as new things are coming up every year. It seems like there's some breakthrough, but we don't know. We're in the middle of it. We'll see.
Right, but I think, you know, the thing that, you know, I didn't really believe in neural nets for a long time. It seemed like they were, the things people were writing, I have to say, just seemed very complicated, very arbitrary, you know, and all these kinds of different methods and so on. It didn't seem to be a coherent kind of scientific set of things to be talking about. And so it's I mean, the fact that suddenly the engineering has started to work has been surprising. And it's you know, I'm just curious, for somebody like you, you know, the thread of belief in your case is probably linked to the fact that you're interested in how brains work. I mean, had you been purely interested in the technological side of it, maybe you wouldn't have continued to be a believer.
Okay, here was my belief and my intuition, which I think Jeff Hinton shared, which is that the only existence proof that any problem, vision, intelligence, could be solved was the fact that nature solved them, right? Somehow. Right. So why not look under the hood and try to extract some principles, general principles, like massively parallel, like high connectivity, like learning, right? Basic principles, see how far we can get, right? That was a very, it seemed obvious to me back then. Of course, I didn't know how long it would take, but, it was just a matter of believing in nature.
But there's a certain sense in which there's molecular scale stuff going on in the brain. People say, oh, we can only explain brains by thinking about quantum mechanics, all these kinds of things. You don't know how low you're going to have to go. And the fact that I think one of the things that's really very interesting about ChatGPT is it kind of tells you that a large chunk of the kind of language and language-related thinking really can be done at this pure computational level. That there's no mysterious, infrastructure underneath there.
Right. So that I think this is an interesting observation, and I think language is very recent. It's only within the last 100,000 years, so it couldn't have evolved a language organ, which is what Chomsky believes. Right? It had to have used all of the machinery that was already there, maybe using it in a different way. And it's all about sensory motor loops and controls. And I already told you about the basal ganglia playing a role in sequences of actions. So if the brain was already set up for it, right, and natural, and because language maps so well onto the brain, the machinery that was already there means that there's some principles, right, that language had to be using similar principles that, say, vision was using, or auditory processing, speech recognition.
Right. By the way, is it the case that the timing of words coming out, if you look at your loop in this basal ganglion, cortex loop, can you measure, the time it takes the signals?
Yeah. It takes about 100 milliseconds to go from the cortex to the basal ganglion back to the cortex again. And
how many words do we say in 100 milliseconds? We say a word or two in 100 milliseconds?
Okay, it depends on the words, but I'm thinking that it's about 10 words a second. That I think that's pretty fast.
Yeah.
That's fast talking.
So you're saying every time we do one of those loops, we make a word?
I think no, I don't think it's a word. It could be just a phoneme. Maybe it's just a sound.
Oh, like a token in ChatGPT.
Yeah, like a token.
Making one token, just like it is.
Right. Maybe at that level.
You think that, you think it's plausible that the outer loop of human language is that loop, which is the same type of thing as.
I can't imagine it being anything else. That outer loop is what we use for doing things like sports and very complex thinking.
Okay, so let's assume you're right that language, which I'm sure is true, that language is simply sort of recruiting existing characteristics of the brain.
Right.
The question is, okay, so you say language is invented in the last 100,000 years. One could discuss whether other critters have some form of language, but let's assume it was invented fairly recently in us, so to speak. The question is, what other things can we recruit from other parts of the brain to have quite different kinds of modalities of action? I mean, language has proved to be pretty useful because it's a way of communicating abstract ideas from generation to generation, so to speak. And so a question would be, if we try to imagine, for the aliens that have the same basic brain architecture, but they've invented two more general ideas. What would those do we have a clue about what those general ideas might be?
Well, now you're talking about the future.
Okay. Now I'm talking about
but here's something to keep in mind, which is that language is imperfect. It's very slippery. These concepts like intelligence or understanding, which people are arguing about, they're saying, oh, GPT-3 can't possibly understand what it's talking about, right? It just sounds like it understands what it's talking about. What's understanding mean? How do you define it? How do you measure it?
Well, I mean, for me, because I've spent my life kind of building computational language, for me, it's, you have this thing, can it be evaluated? Can you compute from it? That is an operational definition of saying that you've got this representation of something that can actually, in language, that is not what we do. In language, we are just sort of building pieces on top of what we have said. But if we are thinking about computational language, where you've actually taken the utterance and you've converted it to something where the computer can go off and execute something from it, that is an operational definition of understanding. It's not the one that, mostly it's not the one that we use, but that's an operational definition.
So there are many, that's a very good one. And there are probably many other definitions that other people use. That's why they get into arguments, because people have different definitions when they're trying to understand something themselves.
Well, I think the point you're making there, in effect, is that, you know, what we do in computational language and the way that we evaluate things, execute things from that, is something brains actually don't do. And potentially, you know, and so I suppose that's an answer to this question of, okay, so what else could, you know, if we've invented language in the last 100,000 years, what could we invent? And then the question is, does the architecture of the brain support, does the, you know, architecture of computers and so on, does support executing computational languages? That's obvious. The architecture of the brain supports that. But yeah, now we are indeed talking about the future, and we're talking about
and we can go on for many more hours. So, you know, let's plan to get together again sometime.
Yes, indeed. And did we miss? I mean, you know, in terms of the history, you know, you talk about other perspectives, but I think we covered you know, from what I know of this history, I think we now, you know, I know some of this history I know through you, but some of it I know independently, and I think we hit most of the big topics that I'm aware of that came in there.
Yeah, there are many side pathways that you know, many more people should be given credit. I have to say that you know, I've focused on people I know and people I've worked with and so forth, but so many other people out there that, in fact, I can't keep up with the literature anymore, you know, and coming out of archive, it's just overwhelming.
Well, right. I mean, you know, this is a field which has gone from a tiny group of people during its sort of, you know, lean period to, you know, it must have gone from tens of people to maybe even 100,000 people or something.
At some point that, you know, I was talking to Eugene Wigner once. He was taught me statistical mechanics when I was at Princeton. And I asked him what it was like to be there, you know, in Europe when quantum mechanics was being discovered. And he said that, well, first of all, back then, physicists didn't have the kind of prestige it had back then. It was, in fact, it was very few jobs were available at universities, and you couldn't get, you know, it wasn't very lucrative. And his father told him that he should get a job in chemical engineering, which he did. Okay, and he said that the number of theoretical physicists were so small you could know them all. And he would write letters back and forth. Right. And that was how the whole thing got off the ground. And maybe that's the way all things get off the ground. It's never, you know, you don't start with a mass of people. You start with a small group that actually believes in what they're doing, and they're willing to give up a lot of prestige or whatever money to do it.
I think this is a weird case. I think neural nets are a bit unusual because I think that, as we were mentioning earlier, there were all these separate little pockets. I think that's not so common. I think many of these things, you know, the tree grows from one trunk, so to speak.
Ah, okay. That's an interesting observation. Yeah.
Because I don't think in quantum mechanics, there were not multiple trunks. It was not like there were different pockets of things going on. It was pretty much just one.
Right.
But I think with neural nets, what's strange is that the original sort of McCulloch Pitts style initiation is the seed, I think, from which all the other stuff grew. And yet there were all these separate branches, and, you know, the same seed, but it wasn't a single trunk from that. And that, I think, is unusual. And I think that the time scale, also the time scale from the initial seed to fruition is extremely long. I mean, many generations.
Okay, so one possible explanation for that, I agree that it was very diverse, but one possible explanation is you have a much bigger search space to explore. And many groups were going off and searching different parts of computation space, right? Cohonen and Stu Gieman and so forth. And you know, it took a long time for all of those to sort of be unified into large scale, was called machine learning for a long time. You know, NeurIPS was was the biggest machine learning conference and the most important. Now it's been rebranded as an AI meeting, although it's still we're talking, it's still neural networks, which is what we started with.
Right.
But it's gotten much richer and much more sophisticated in terms of computational understanding of graphical models and things.
But it is so bizarre that the original neural net idea from whatever it is, what is it, 85 years ago or something,
right,
is still, that's what's running inside ChatGPT. I mean, lots and lots of copies of that.
It was, yeah, that's shocking. That it could have built from simple ideas that were floating around back then and coalescing. But by the way, the amount of resources that went into these large language models is staggering.
Yeah, right. Well, that's a whole different
$10 million to learn a single network, right? Oh my God, that's
right. Well, we'll see whether maybe the brain has figured out much better ways to do it, and right. It's all right. Well, we should wrap up here. Thank you all for thank you, Terry, for
you're welcome. Welcome, Stephen.
Interesting conversation, and thanks to folks who've been listening here. And we shall see you all another time. Another time we meet and talk about the future.
Back to the future.
Indeed.